She lost everything in a single afternoon. The aunt who raised her, her home, her dreams, and just when she thought nothing else could happen, came the unexpected clause. She would only receive her inheritance if she got married. The man chosen, Nathaniel Carter, a former general, unreadable, wrapped in silence, a loveless marriage, a mansion full of rules, but little by little, through quiet gestures and glances that speak softly, she'll discover his heart isn't cold. It was just waiting for someone who knew how to listen between the beats of silence. The morning mist clung to the ancient oak trees like whispered secrets, their Spanish moss swaying gently in the Charleston breeze. Nathaniel Carter stood at the tall windows of his study, watching the sun pierce through the canopy that had sheltered his family's mansion for over 2 centuries. The house on south of Broad Street bore the weight of history in every brick, every carved molding, every portrait that gazed down from oil-darkened frames. At 35, Nathaniel carried that same weight in his shoulders, broad from years of military discipline, now bearing the responsibility of a legacy he hadn't asked for, but couldn't abandon. The morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, premature marks of a man who had seen too much, felt too deeply, and learned to hide it all behind walls of propriety and control. His reflection in the window showed a face that could have been carved from Charleston marble. Strong jaw, steel-grey eyes that revealed nothing, and lips that rarely curved into genuine smiles. The uniform had been replaced by perfectly tailored suits, but the posture remained. Spine straight, hands clasped behind his back, ready for whatever battle awaited. The St. Augustine Health Center had become his purpose, his redemption. What had started as a way to honor his grandmother's memory had grown into something larger, a network of clinics serving the forgotten corners of the Low Country. It was there, among the struggling families and underserved communities, that he found the closest thing to peace his restless soul could manage. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion, but this morning, peace felt impossibly distant. The letter on his mahogany desk bore the familiar handwriting of Eleanor Whitmore, though her usual steady script had grown shaky in recent months. Eleanor, the woman who had been his grandmother's dearest friend, who had visited him during the darkest period of his return from overseas, who had seen through his careful facades to the broken man beneath. "Nathaniel, my dear boy," the letter began, "I fear my time grows short, and there is a matter of utmost importance I must entrust to you. My great niece Claire has no one left in this world but me. When I am gone, she will be alone, and I cannot bear the thought of her struggling as I once did. The inheritance I leave her comes with conditions, old-fashioned perhaps, but necessary for her protection. You knew my heart as I knew yours. I ask this of you not as a burden, but as the greatest gift you could give an old woman's worried spirit." Eleanor had passed 3 days ago. The funeral had been small, attended by a handful of longtime friends and one young woman who stood apart from the rest, tall and graceful, with auburn hair that caught the afternoon light and eyes the color of sea glass. She had spoken little, wept quietly, and accepted condolences with a dignity that reminded him achingly of Eleanor herself. Claire Whitmore, 23 years old, final year medical student, and now completely alone in the world. Nathaniel had watched her from across the cemetery, noting the way she carried herself, straight-backed despite her grief, kind eyes even in sorrow. She possessed something he had lost long ago, a natural warmth that seemed to radiate from within, untouched by the cynicism that had marked his own journey. The conditions of Eleanor's will were unusual, to say the least. The inheritance, modest but sufficient to see Claire through her remaining studies and into her career, would only be released upon her marriage to a man of good standing, approved by the family's designated guardian. That guardian, by Eleanor's specific request, was Nathaniel himself. It was an arrangement from another era, when women needed male protection to navigate the world's complexities. Yet Eleanor had been no romantic fool. She had been a survivor, a woman who understood that sometimes unconventional solutions were necessary for conventional problems. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Henderson, his housekeeper of 15 years, appeared in the doorway with her usual efficiency. "The young lady is here to see you, Mr. Carter, Miss Whitmore." Nathaniel straightened, though his posture had been perfect already. "Show her to the front parlor, please. I'll be there presently." He took a moment to compose himself, studying his reflection once more. The man in the window looked exactly as he always did, controlled, unreadable, prepared. It was a mask he had perfected over years of necessity, but somehow he suspected that Eleanor's great-niece might see through it as easily as Eleanor herself had done. The front parlor was filled with morning light, the cream silk curtains doing little to soften the sun streaming through the tall windows. Claire sat on the edge of the antique settee, her hands folded in her lap, looking both composed and slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding her. She wore a simple navy dress that complemented her fair complexion, her auburn hair pulled back in a style that was practical rather than fashionable. There was something indefinably graceful about her, a natural elegance that had nothing to do with designer clothes or expensive jewelry. When she looked up at his entrance, Nathaniel felt something unexpected, a flutter of, what? Recognition? Attraction? He dismissed it immediately, focusing instead on the matter at hand. "Miss Whitmore." He remained standing, hands clasped behind his back. "Thank you for coming. Mr. Carter." Her voice was softer than he had expected, with just a hint of the southern drawl that marked her as a true daughter of the region. "I appreciate you taking the time to see me." An awkward silence stretched between them. Nathaniel found himself studying the way the light played across her features, the gentle curve of her cheek, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence that sparkled in those remarkable eyes. "I imagine you have questions about your great-aunt's will," he said finally, settling into the chair across from her. Claire's composure wavered slightly. "I have to admit, I'm confused. Aunt Eleanor never mentioned any conditions. She always said education was the path to independence, that a woman should never have to depend on anyone for her security." "Your aunt was a practical woman," Nathaniel replied carefully. "She understood that sometimes we must work within the system to achieve our goals, even if that system seems outdated. Marriage." The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. "She wants me to marry someone I don't even know." "Not someone you don't know," Nathaniel corrected quietly. "Someone she trusted to protect what matters most to her, your future, your safety, your ability to become the doctor she believed you could be." Claire's eyes widened slightly as understanding dawned. "You?" He nodded once, crisply. "The arrangement would be purely practical. A legal formality to satisfy the conditions of the will. You would have your inheritance, complete your studies, and begin your career. After a suitable period, the marriage could be dissolved if that was your wish. And what would you get out of this arrangement?" Her voice held a note of suspicion, as if she couldn't quite believe in altruistic motives. Nathaniel considered his answer carefully. The truth, that he owed Eleanor Whitmore more than he could ever repay, that honoring her final request felt like the only meaningful thing he could do, seemed too personal, too revealing. "Your aunt once helped me through a difficult period in my life," he said instead. "I consider this a way of repaying that debt." Claire was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving around the elegant room before returning to his face. "This house," she said softly, "it's like something from another century." "It was built in 1847, Nathaniel replied. "6 generations of Carters have lived here. And now you want to bring a stranger into all of this history. You wouldn't be a stranger." The words came out more forcefully than he had intended. "Eleanor spoke of you often, your kindness, your determination, your gift for healing. She loved you very much." For the first time since entering the room, Claire's composure cracked slightly. Tears glistened in her eyes, though she didn't let them fall. "I miss her so much," she whispered. "She was all I had left." Something shifted in Nathaniel's chest, a loosening of the tight control he maintained over his emotions. Without thinking, he leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to decide today," he said, his voice gentler than before. "Take whatever time you need. The inheritance will wait." Claire looked at him then, with an expression he couldn't quite read, surprise perhaps that he understood her need for time, or maybe gratitude that he wasn't pressuring her for an immediate answer. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Do you really think this is what she would have wanted? A marriage of convenience between two people who barely know each other?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I think your aunt wanted to ensure that you had choices," he said finally. that you wouldn't face the world alone without resources or protection. Whether those choices include a real marriage someday, that would be entirely up to you. Claire stood, smoothing her dress with hands that trembled slightly. I should go, I have classes this afternoon. Nathaniel rose as well, his ingrained manners demanding the courtesy. Mrs. Henderson will see you out. She paused at the doorway, looking back at him. Mr. Carter, thank you for loving her too. It helps, knowing she had people who cared. After she left, Nathaniel remained in the parlor, staring at the empty settee where she had sat. The room felt different somehow, warmer, more alive. For the first time in years, the weight of his legacy didn't feel quite so heavy. 3 days later, Claire Whitmore called to accept his proposal. The courthouse wedding took exactly 14 minutes. Claire stood beside Nathaniel in the sterile government office, wearing the same navy dress she had worn to their first meeting, the only formal dress she owned. Her hands were bare. They hadn't discussed rings, and the oversight felt like a physical manifestation of the arrangement's practical nature. Judge Morrison, a longtime family friend, performed the brief ceremony with professional efficiency. The words felt hollow in the small room. Do you, Nathaniel, take Claire? The vows were legal promises, nothing more. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss, only a formal handshake and the scratch of pens on official documents. Mrs. Henderson served as witness, along with the judge's secretary. As they signed the marriage certificate, Claire noticed Nathaniel's handwriting, precise, controlled, revealing nothing of the man behind it. His signature was exactly what she would have expected. Strong, angular, uncompromising. The drive back to the mansion was conducted in silence. Claire stared out the window at the familiar streets of Charleston, watching tourists snap photos of historic homes and horse-drawn carriages. Everything looked the same, yet she felt fundamentally changed. No longer Claire Whitmore, medical student and orphan, but Claire Carter, wife to a man she barely knew. What have I done? The thought echoed in her mind as they pulled through the wrought-iron gates of the Carter estate. The house loomed before them, its antebellum grandeur both beautiful and intimidating. Spanish moss draped the ancient oaks like wedding veils, a romantic touch that felt cruelly ironic given the circumstances. Mrs. Henderson has prepared the blue guest room for you, Nathaniel said as they entered the foyer. His voice was carefully neutral, businesslike. It has its own bathroom and sitting area. You should be comfortable there. The blue guest room. Not the master suite, not even a suggestion that they might share space as married couples typically did. Relief and something that might have been disappointment warred in Claire's chest. That's very thoughtful, she replied, matching his formal tone. Nathaniel checked his watch, a vintage Rolex that had probably belonged to his father or grandfather. Dinner is served at 7. Mrs. Henderson will show you around the house later, help you get settled. What about you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. I have work to attend to. His grey eyes met hers briefly before sliding away. The clinic requires my attention. He was already moving toward his study, dismissing her with the efficiency of a military commander. Claire watched him go, noting the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he seemed to carry himself like a man braced for attack. He's as uncomfortable with this as I am, she realized. The thought was oddly comforting. Mrs. Henderson appeared as if summoned, her kind face creased with what might have been sympathy or amusement. Claire couldn't tell which. Come along, dear, the housekeeper said gently. Let me show you to your room. The blue guest room was larger than Claire's entire apartment near the medical school. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, draped in silk the color of robin's eggs. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the garden, where camellias bloomed in cheerful defiance of the autumn chill. It's beautiful, Claire said softly, running her fingers along the antique writing desk positioned by the window. Mr. Nathaniel's grandmother decorated this room, Mrs. Henderson confided. She always said it was meant for someone special, a daughter or daughter-in-law who would appreciate its history. The older woman's eyes twinkled with something that looked suspiciously like matchmaking satisfaction. Claire wondered how much Mrs. Henderson knew about the true nature of this marriage. The master bedroom is at the end of the hall, Mrs. Henderson continued, busying herself with hanging Claire's few dresses in the enormous wardrobe. Mr. Nathaniel keeps early hours, usually up before dawn for his run, then breakfast at 6:30 sharp. He's very particular about his schedule. Of course he is, Claire murmured, already sensing the rigid structure that governed this house. "Don't let his formality fool you, dear." Mrs. Henderson's voice grew gentler. "He's a good man, just careful with his heart. Lost too much too young, if you understand my meaning." Claire wanted to ask what she meant, but something in the housekeeper's expression warned her off. There were layers to Nathaniel Carter that she couldn't even begin to understand, depths hidden beneath that controlled surface. That evening, dinner was served in the formal dining room, a cavernous space that could have seated 20 but felt vast and empty, with just the two of them at opposite ends of the polished mahogany table. Candlelight flickered off crystal glasses and silver serving pieces, creating an atmosphere of elegance that somehow made the silence between them even more pronounced. Nathaniel had changed into a fresh shirt and jacket, though he still looked as if he were attending a business meeting rather than dining with his new wife. He ate with the same precision he applied to everything else, measured bites, perfect posture, no wasted motion. "How are your studies progressing?" he asked, making what Claire recognized as an effort at conversation. "Well, thank you. I'm doing my clinical rotations now, pediatrics this month." She tried to inject some warmth into her voice. "I love working with children. They're so resilient, so quick to trust." Something flickered across Nathaniel's face, interest perhaps, or approval. "Eleanor mentioned you have a gift for healing." "Aunt Eleanor was biased," Claire replied with a small smile. "But I do love what I do, even when it's heartbreaking." "Medicine is often heartbreaking," he agreed quietly. "At the clinic, we see people at their most vulnerable. It requires a certain strength to bear witness to that much pain." It was the most personal thing he had said to her, and Claire found herself leaning forward slightly, hungry for any glimpse of the man behind the facade. "Is that why you started the St. Augustine Center? To help people?" The shutters came down immediately. Nathaniel's expression closed off, returning to its neutral mask. "It seemed like a worthwhile endeavor," he said dismissively. "The community had needs that weren't being met." And just like that, the door slammed shut, Claire thought. Every time she sensed an opening, a crack in his armor, he sealed it before she could reach through. They finished the meal in renewed silence. When Mrs. Henderson appeared with coffee and what looked like homemade cheesecake, Claire's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, you shouldn't have gone to so much trouble." "No trouble at all, dear," Mrs. Henderson beamed. "Mr. Nathaniel mentioned it was your favorite." Claire's gaze flew to Nathaniel, who was suddenly very interested in his coffee cup. Heat crept up her neck as she realized he had been paying attention during their brief conversations, storing away small details about her preferences. "Thank you," she said softly, directing the words to both of them. Nathaniel stood abruptly, his napkin falling to his chair. "If you'll excuse me, I have some calls to make." He was gone before Claire could respond, leaving her alone with her cheesecake and 1,000 unanswered questions. Later that night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, Claire could hear the soft murmur of Nathaniel's voice from down the hall. He was in his study, talking to someone about patient care protocols and funding allocations. His voice carried differently in the quiet house, warmer somehow, more animated when discussing his work. He does care, she realized. He just doesn't know how to show it. The house settled around her with the gentle creaks and sighs of old wood and established foundations. Moonlight streamed through the French doors, painting silver patterns on the Persian rug. It was beautiful and peaceful, yet Claire had never felt more alone. She thought about the strange turn her life had taken, from orphaned student to wife of one of Charleston's most eligible bachelors in the span of a few days. The security was undeniable. She would finish medical school without worrying about tuition or rent. But the emotional cost was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Nathaniel Carter was a mystery wrapped in propriety and bound with military discipline. There were depths to him she could sense but couldn't reach, walls built so high and strong that she wondered if even he remembered what lay behind them. "What am I doing here?" she asked the moonlit room. "What did Aunt Eleanor really want for us?" As if in answer, a soft knock came at her door. Claire's heart jumped, thinking it might be Nathaniel, but it was only Mrs. Henderson with an extra blanket and a cup of chamomile tea. "The house gets drafty at night," the housekeeper explained kindly, "and this should help you sleep." "Mrs. Henderson," Claire said impulsively, "what happened to him? What made him so guarded?" The older woman's expression grew thoughtful. "That's not my story to tell, dear, but I will say this. Sometimes the strongest walls are built by people who've been hurt the most. They're not trying to keep everyone out. They're trying to keep themselves together. After she left, Claire sat curled in the window seat, sipping her tea and watching the garden below. Somewhere in the house, her husband, was working late into the night, maintaining the careful distance he seemed to require. Give it time, she told herself. Eleanor trusted him for a reason, but as the clock chimed midnight, marking the end of her first day as Mrs. Nathaniel Carter, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that time alone wouldn't be enough to bridge the vast space between them. The architecture of distance, she was learning, was far more complex than simple physical separation. The first week of marriage passed like a carefully choreographed dance between strangers. Claire learned Nathaniel's routines with the precision of a medical student memorizing anatomy. Up at 5:30 for his run through the historic district, breakfast at exactly 6:30, gone to the clinic by 7:15. He returned each evening at precisely 6:45, always carrying his leather briefcase and wearing the same expression of controlled exhaustion. They spoke politely at meals, sharing surface pleasantries about the weather, her classes, the progress at various clinic locations. But beneath the civilized veneer, Claire sensed something else, a heightened awareness whenever they occupied the same space, a tension that had nothing to do with awkwardness and everything to do with something neither of them was ready to acknowledge. It was the small things that began to chip away at her assumptions about him, the cheesecake that appeared in the refrigerator every few days, despite the fact that she'd only mentioned it being her favorite once. The way her coffee cup was always perfectly warmed when she came down for breakfast, even though she kept irregular hours due to her clinical rotations. The stack of medical journals that materialized on the table in her sitting area, current issues she couldn't have afforded on her student budget. "I thought you might find these useful," Nathaniel said when she thanked him, his tone carefully neutral. The hospital was discarding them. But Claire had noticed the subscription labels. They were addressed to him personally, delivered fresh from the publisher. He was lying, and they both knew it, but the lie itself was a kindness. On Thursday evening, she found herself studying late in the garden pavilion, taking advantage of the unusually warm October night. The old structure was nestled among the camellia bushes, its white columns wrapped in Confederate jasmine that filled the air with sweet fragrance. Her anatomy textbooks were spread across the wrought iron table, and she was so absorbed in memorizing nerve pathways that she didn't hear footsteps on the gravel path. "You'll ruin your eyes reading by that light." Claire looked up to find Nathaniel standing at the pavilion's entrance. Having approached so silently, she wondered if he'd learned that skill in the military. He carried 2 glasses and a pitcher of what looked like sweet tea. "I brought better lighting," he continued, setting a battery-powered lantern on the table. The warm glow immediately improved her reading conditions while maintaining the garden's peaceful ambience. "Thank you," she said softly, watching as he poured tea into both glasses. "You didn't have to—" "Mrs. Henderson made too much," he interrupted, though Claire suspected this was another of his careful fabrications. It seemed wasteful to let it go bad. He remained standing, clearly uncertain whether his presence was welcome. Claire gestured to the chair across from her. "Please sit, unless you have somewhere else to be." Something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, that she would want his company. He settled into the chair with his usual precise movements, though she noticed his shoulders weren't quite as rigid as usual. "Neuroanatomy," he observed, glancing at her open textbook. "The bane of every medical student's existence," Claire replied with a rueful smile. "I swear these nerve pathways were designed by someone with a sadistic sense of humor." "The median nerve pathway," Nathaniel said unexpectedly, "runs from the lateral and medial cords of the brachial plexus through the carpal tunnel, innervating the thenar muscles and the first 3.5 digits. Claire stared at him. Do you have medical training?" A shadow crossed his face. "Combat medic training. Army requires field commanders to have basic medical knowledge." He paused, then added quietly, "It saves lives when proper medical help isn't available." It was the first real glimpse he'd given her into his military service, and Claire found herself hungry for more details. But something in his expression warned her not to push. "That's actually really helpful," she said instead. Would you mind helping me review some of these? Having someone to quiz me makes a huge difference." For the next hour, they worked through her study materials together. Nathaniel's knowledge was more extensive than he'd let on. clearly beyond basic combat medic training. His explanations were precise and thorough, delivered in the same controlled tone he used for everything else. But Claire noticed the way his eyes lit up when discussing complex medical concepts, the enthusiasm he couldn't quite suppress when explaining how theoretical knowledge applied to real-world treatment. "You should have been a doctor," she said impulsively during a break between sections. Nathaniel's expression shuttered immediately. "I chose a different path." "But why? You obviously have the knowledge, the aptitude." "Some paths are chosen for us," he said firmly, closing her textbook with a definitive snap. "It's getting late. You should get some rest." He was standing before she could respond, gathering the glasses and pitcher with efficient movements. The wall had slammed down again, leaving Claire feeling as if she'd been dismissed from a classified briefing. "Nathaniel," she began. "Good night, Claire." His voice was polite but final. She watched him disappear into the shadows of the garden path, leaving her alone with her books and 100 new questions about the man she'd married. The next morning brought their first real conflict. Claire was running late for her pediatric rotation, having stayed up too long reviewing the material Nathaniel had helped her with. She rushed into the kitchen to grab a quick breakfast, only to find him standing by the coffee maker with a disapproving expression. "You missed breakfast," he said without preamble. "I know, I'm sorry, I overslept." She reached for a piece of toast from the rack, but his next words stopped her cold. "Mrs. Henderson prepared a full meal. It's inconsiderate to ignore her efforts." Claire slowly turned to face him, noting the rigid set of his shoulders and the controlled coolness in his grey eyes. "Excuse me?" "This household runs on a schedule," he continued, in the same measured tone he might use to address subordinates. "Meals are served at specific times. If you can't manage to maintain basic courtesy—" "Basic courtesy?" Claire's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "I'm a medical student in the middle of clinical rotations. My schedule isn't always predictable. Everyone has responsibilities. And mine don't include being your perfectly punctual wife for show." The words exploded out of her before she could stop them. "This isn't a real marriage, remember. You made that very clear." Nathaniel went very still, his face becoming a mask of cold control. "You're quite right. My apologies for the confusion." The ice in his voice was worse than shouting would have been. Claire immediately regretted her outburst, but pride kept her from backing down. "I have to go," she said stiffly. "I'm already late." "Of course." He stepped aside with military precision, allowing her to pass without coming anywhere near touching her. Claire grabbed her bag and keys, then paused at the kitchen door. "For what it's worth, I wasn't trying to be disrespectful to Mrs. Henderson. I appreciate everything she does." Nathaniel said nothing, but she saw his jaw tighten slightly. The day at the hospital was a disaster. Claire's mind kept drifting back to the morning's confrontation, replaying Nathaniel's words and her own sharp response. During rounds, she mixed up 2 patients' charts. In the pediatric ward, she was so distracted that Dr. Martinez had to repeat questions twice. "Carter," he said finally, pulling her aside. "Everything all right? You seem elsewhere today." "Just tired," she lied. "Late night studying." But Dr. Martinez's knowing look suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. By the time she returned to the mansion that evening, Claire had rehearsed various apologies, each one sounding more pathetic than the last. She found Nathaniel in his study, bent over paperwork spread across his massive desk. The room smelled of leather and aged wood, with just a hint of the cologne he wore, something expensive and understated that seemed to suit him perfectly. He looked up when she knocked on the open door, his expression carefully neutral. "I owe you an apology," Claire said without preamble. "What I said this morning was unfair and unkind. You're right that Mrs. Henderson works hard to take care of this household, and I should be more considerate of her efforts." Nathaniel set down his pen, studying her with those penetrating grey eyes. "And I owe you an apology as well. I spoke to you as if you were a subordinate rather than—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Rather than treating you with the respect you deserve. Rather than treating me like your wife," Claire suggested gently. Something flickered across his features, pain perhaps, or longing. "Rather than treating you like a guest in your own home." Your own home. The words sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. It was the first time he'd suggested she belonged here, that this arrangement was anything more than a temporary convenience. "Truce," she offered, stepping into the study. "Truce," he agreed, though his posture remained guarded. Claire noticed the papers scattered across his desk. Budgets for the clinic, patient statistics, grant applications. "You work too hard," she observed. "The work needs to be done." "But not all by you, surely. Don't you have staff to help with this?" Nathaniel's smile was wry and humorless. "I've never been particularly good at delegation." "Control issues?" she asked with gentle teasing. "Something like that." His answer was serious, lacking any trace of humor. "I've learned that if you want something done properly, it's best to handle it yourself." Claire heard the deeper meaning in his words, the suggestion of betrayals, of trust, broken by people who should have been reliable. She wanted to ask more, to understand what had shaped him into this controlled, self-sufficient man, but she was beginning to learn the boundaries of his willingness to share. "Well," she said instead, "if you ever want someone to help you review grant applications, I'm pretty good with paperwork. Medical school requires a lot of forms and documentation." Nathaniel looked surprised by the offer. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to, I want to. The clinic is important work, and if I can help in some small way." For a moment his mask slipped, and she saw something vulnerable in his eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or simple amazement that someone would offer to share his burdens without being asked. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I might take you up on that." That night, Claire found a small plate of Mrs. Henderson's butter cookies on her nightstand, along with a glass of milk and a note in Nathaniel's precise handwriting. "For late-night studying. You'll need your strength for tomorrow's rotation." She fell asleep smiling, the cookies half finished and the note pressed against her heart like a secret worth keeping. The fever came on suddenly, striking Claire during her night shift in the pediatric ICU. She'd been feeling slightly off all day, a headache that wouldn't respond to aspirin, an unusual chill despite the hospital's oppressive heating. By midnight, she was shivering uncontrollably while trying to take vital signs on a 6-year-old patient recovering from surgery. "Carter, you look terrible," observed Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician on duty. "When's the last time you took your temperature?" Claire tried to protest that she was fine, but the thermometer didn't lie. 102.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Dr. Chen immediately ordered her home, threatening to call security if she didn't leave voluntarily. The taxi ride back to the mansion passed in a feverish haze. Claire's head pounded with each streetlight they passed, and her clothes were soaked with perspiration, despite the chills racking her body. She fumbled with her key at the front door, grateful when Mrs. Henderson appeared in her dressing gown. "Lord have mercy, child, you look half dead," the housekeeper exclaimed, immediately pressing a cool hand to Claire's forehead. "Mr. Nathaniel is going to have a fit when he sees you like this." "Don't wake him," Claire managed through chattering teeth. "It's just a little flu, I'll be fine by morning." But her body had other plans. By the time Mrs. Henderson helped her upstairs, Claire was burning up and barely coherent. The housekeeper settled her into bed, then disappeared to gather supplies: cool washcloths, fever reducers, and a large pitcher of ice water. "I'm calling Mr. Nathaniel," Mrs. Henderson announced, reaching for the bedside phone. "Please don't," Claire whispered. "He's probably at some important meeting." "I don't want to bother him." "Bother him?" Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows shot up. "Child, you're his wife. You're never a bother." The words sent a strange warmth through Claire's fevered mind. His wife. Sometimes she forgot that part was real, even if everything else about their arrangement felt like an elaborate performance. 20 minutes later, Claire heard rapid footsteps in the hallway, followed by Nathaniel's voice speaking in urgent, clipped tones to Mrs. Henderson. The bedroom door opened, and even through her fever haze, Claire could see the barely controlled worry etched across his features. "What's her temperature now?" he asked Mrs. Henderson, though his eyes never left Claire's face. 103.1, and climbing. I gave her acetaminophen, but it's not touching the fever." Nathaniel moved to the bedside with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to medical emergencies. His hand was blessedly cool against her forehead, and Claire found herself leaning into the touch without thinking. How long has she been like this? His voice carried the authoritative tone she'd heard him use when discussing clinic protocols. "She came home about an hour ago, but I suspect she's been fighting this all day. You know how stubborn medical students can be about admitting they're sick." Claire tried to protest that she wasn't that stubborn, but the words came out as an incoherent mumble. Nathaniel's hand moved to check the pulse point at her wrist, his touch gentle but unmistakably clinical. "We need to get her temperature down," he said, rolling up his sleeves with brisk efficiency. "Mrs. Henderson, could you bring more ice packs and some cool washcloths, and call Dr. Weber? Tell him I may need him to make a house call." "Dr. Weber?" Mrs. Henderson looked surprised. "Sir, that man hasn't made a house call in 10 years. He'll make one tonight," Nathaniel replied with quiet certainty. "Tell him it's for my wife." "My wife." The words sent another warm flutter through Claire's chest, though she couldn't be sure if it was the fever or something else entirely. The next few hours passed in a blur of cool compresses, gentle hands adjusting her position, and Nathaniel's low voice speaking in soothing tones she'd never heard from him before. He'd shed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms that were surprisingly muscular for a man who spent most of his time behind a desk. "Try to drink this," he coaxed, holding a glass of ice water to her lips. "Small sips." Claire obeyed, though her hands were shaking too badly to hold the glass herself. Nathaniel's arms slipped behind her shoulders, supporting her weight as if she weighed nothing at all. The intimacy of the gesture, the way he cradled her against his chest while she drank, sent her already racing heart into overdrive. "Better?" he asked softly, settling her back against the pillows. Claire nodded, though the movement made her head spin. "You don't have to stay," she whispered. "I know you have work tomorrow." Nathaniel's expression grew stern. "Work can wait. You're more important." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either was prepared to acknowledge. Claire studied his face in the lamplight, noting the worry lines around his eyes, the way his usually perfect hair was disheveled from running his hands through it. "Have you done this before?" she asked, her voice hoarse but curious. "Done what?" "Taken care of someone who was sick. You seem to know exactly what you're doing." Something dark flickered across Nathaniel's features. "I've had some experience with medical emergencies," he said carefully. "Nothing that would qualify me as a nurse, but enough to keep you comfortable until Dr. Weber arrives." Dr. Weber turned out to be a distinguished gentleman in his 70s who arrived at 3 a.m. without complaint, carrying a leather medical bag that looked like a museum piece. He examined Claire with old-fashioned thoroughness while Nathaniel hovered nearby, asking pointed questions about treatment protocols and recovery timeframes. "Nasty flu strain going around," Dr. Weber announced after completing his examination. "Nothing that won't resolve with rest and fluids, but she'll need careful monitoring for the next 24 hours. Fever this high can be dangerous if it spikes further." "I'll stay with her," Nathaniel said without hesitation. Dr. Weber raised an eyebrow. "All due respect, Nathaniel, but when's the last time you slept? You look nearly as bad as she does." "I'm fine." "You're exhausted. Mrs. Henderson can monitor her temperature and wake you if there's any change." "I said I'm fine," Nathaniel repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Dr. Weber glanced between them with knowing eyes. "I see. Well then, make sure she gets plenty of fluids and keep that fever down with regular cooling measures. Call me if her temperature goes above 104 or if she becomes unresponsive." After the doctor left, Nathaniel settled into the armchair beside Claire's bed, clearly prepared to maintain his vigil. Mrs. Henderson brought him coffee and a light blanket, shaking her head at his stubborn refusal to rest. "You really don't have to stay," Claire said weakly. "I'm sure Mrs. Henderson is 72 years old and has already done enough tonight," Nathaniel interrupted. "Besides, I want to be here. I want to be here." The simple declaration sent warmth spreading through Claire's chest that had nothing to do with fever. She watched him through heavy-lidded eyes, studying the way the lamplight cast shadows across his strong profile, the careful way he monitored her breathing as if her life depended on his vigilance. "Tell me about the clinic," she whispered, needing to hear his voice, to focus on something other than the ache in her bones. Nathaniel glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features. "You should rest." "I can't sleep. Everything hurts too much. Please, I like hearing you talk about your work." For a moment, she thought he would refuse. Then his expression softened slightly, and he began speaking in low, measured tones about the St. Augustine Health Center, how it had started as a single mobile unit serving rural communities, how they'd gradually expanded to include dental care, mental health services, and preventive medicine programs. His voice grew warmer as he spoke, revealing a passion he usually kept carefully hidden. Claire found herself drifting on the sound of it, letting his words wash over her like a lullaby. She learned about the teenage mother he'd helped get her GED, the elderly man whose diabetes they'd brought under control, the children who came for regular checkups, who might otherwise never see a doctor. "You save people," she murmured, her eyes growing heavy. "Sometimes," Nathaniel replied quietly. "When I'm lucky." "Eleanor knew," Claire whispered, consciousness beginning to slip away. "She knew you were good." When she woke several hours later, her fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. Grey morning light filtered through the curtains, and she could hear birds singing in the garden below. Nathaniel was still in the armchair, now fast asleep with his head tilted back at what had to be an uncomfortable angle. In sleep his face looked younger, more vulnerable. The harsh lines of control had softened, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been before whatever experiences had taught him to guard himself so carefully. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw, and his usually perfect shirt was wrinkled from the long night. Claire wanted to reach out and smooth the furrow between his brows, to offer him the same gentle care he'd shown her. Instead, she lay still and watched him sleep, memorizing the rare sight of Nathaniel Carter with his defenses down. When he stirred awake 20 minutes later, the walls were back in place almost instantly. But for just a moment, as his eyes found hers and relief flooded his features, Claire caught a glimpse of something that made her heart skip. "How are you feeling?" he asked, immediately leaning forward to check her forehead for fever. "Much better, thanks to you." She caught his hand before he could pull away, squeezing his fingers gently. "Thank you for staying. You didn't have to do that." Nathaniel's gaze dropped to their joined hands, and Claire saw a muscle jump in his jaw. "Yes, I did," he said quietly. "I couldn't have left you alone." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to explore. But as Nathaniel's thumb brushed softly across her knuckles, such a small gesture yet so tender, Claire felt something shift in the careful distance they'd maintained. Whatever walls existed between them, she realized, they weren't impenetrable. And for the first time since accepting his proposal, she began to wonder what might be possible if those walls ever came down completely. Recovery brought an unexpected shift in the atmosphere of the Carter mansion. Nathaniel had insisted Claire take 3 days off from her rotations, despite her protests that she felt fine. What surprised her wasn't his protectiveness. She was beginning to understand that caring for others was deeply ingrained in his nature, but the way he seemed reluctant to return to their previous formal distance. He worked from home those 3 days, claiming he needed to catch up on paperwork. But Claire noticed how he found excuses to check on her, bringing tea at odd hours, delivering medical journals he thought she might find interesting, adjusting the temperature when he noticed her shivering despite her insistence that she wasn't cold. On the second day, she discovered him in the kitchen at noon, standing over the stove with a look of intense concentration that seemed better suited to diffusing a bomb than preparing food. "What are you making?" she asked, padding into the kitchen in her slippers and one of his old sweaters that Mrs. Henderson had mysteriously left folded on her chair. Nathaniel glanced up, and she caught something soft in his expression before his usual composure slipped back into place. "Chicken soup. Mrs. Henderson had to run errands, and I thought—" He trailed off, suddenly looking uncertain. "I probably should have just ordered something." Claire moved closer, peering into the pot where chicken, vegetables, and herbs simmered in what looked like a perfectly respectable broth. "It smells wonderful. Where did you learn to cook?" "Army training covers basic survival skills," he replied, but something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. "This looks more advanced than basic survival." She leaned against the counter beside him, noting the way his shoulders tensed at her proximity. "My attempts at chicken soup usually result in something that resembles dishwater." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The secret is browning the vegetables first. Builds layers of flavor." "Of course it does." Claire found herself smiling back. "You approach cooking the same way you approach everything else, methodically, precisely, with attention to detail. Is that a criticism?" "It's an observation." She studied his profile as he stirred the soup with careful, measured movements. "Though I have to wonder, do you ever do anything spontaneously, just because it feels good in the moment?" Nathaniel went very still, the spoon frozen in his hand. For a moment, Claire thought she'd overstepped, pushed too hard against boundaries he wasn't ready to lower. Then he turned to face her, and the intensity in his grey eyes made her breath catch. Spontaneity is dangerous, he said quietly. It leads to poor decisions, unintended consequences. It also leads to joy, Claire countered gently. To discovery, to moments you couldn't have planned but wouldn't trade for anything. Something flickered across his features, longing, perhaps, or regret for roads not taken. He was standing so close, she could see the flecks of silver in his eyes, could catch the subtle scent of his cologne beneath the kitchen's savory aromas. "I've never been particularly good at joy," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The confession broke something open in Claire's chest. Without thinking, she reached up and touched his cheek, just her fingertips against the slight roughness of his jaw. He froze at the contact, but he didn't pull away. "Maybe you just need practice," she said softly. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the space between them charged with possibility. Then the timer on the stove began beeping, and Nathaniel stepped back, as if emerging from a trance. "The soup," he said unnecessarily, turning to lift the pot from the burner. But Claire had seen the way his hands trembled slightly as he moved, had felt the way his breathing changed in that moment of connection. The walls were still there, but they were developing cracks. That evening she found him in the garden pavilion where she'd been studying the night he'd helped her with anatomy. He was sitting alone in the gathering dusk, a glass of bourbon on the table beside him, staring out at the darkening landscape with an expression of profound melancholy. Claire hesitated at the pavilion's entrance, uncertain whether her presence would be welcome, but something about his posture, the way his shoulders curved inward as if he were trying to make himself smaller, made her decision for her. "Mind if I join you?" she asked softly. Nathaniel glanced up, and for a moment his mask slipped completely. She saw exhaustion there and something that looked like grief. But then he gestured to the chair across from him, his expression smoothing back into neutral territory. "I was just getting some air," he said, though the half-empty glass suggested he'd been there for a while. Claire settled into the chair, noting the way the evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of church bells from downtown Charleston. "This is a beautiful spot, very peaceful." "My grandmother designed this garden," Nathaniel said unexpectedly. "She believed outdoor spaces should feel like outdoor rooms, intimate, purposeful, but still wild enough to surprise you. She sounds like a wise woman." She was. His voice carried warmth and sadness in equal measure. "She would have liked you." The simple statement sent an unexpected flutter through Claire's chest. "Tell me about her." Nathaniel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, perhaps loosened by the bourbon or the intimacy of the setting, he began to speak. "Eleanor Whitmore was her best friend," he said. "They met as young women, both married to men who were frequently away. My grandfather was in the diplomatic corps. Your aunt's husband was in the merchant marine. They supported each other through everything. Pregnancies, losses, the social expectations that came with their positions. Is that why Aunt Eleanor trusted you with me? Because your grandmother vouched for your character?" Nathaniel's smile was rueful. "Something like that. When I came back from overseas..." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I wasn't in a good place. Eleanor saw past the anger and the isolation. She helped me find purpose again. The clinic, among other things." He took a sip of bourbon, then met her eyes directly. "She saw potential for healing where I only saw damage." Claire heard the deeper meaning in his words, the suggestion that Eleanor had seen potential for emotional healing as well as professional purpose. She was right, wasn't she, about the potential? "I'm still working on that," Nathaniel replied quietly. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled around them. String lights automatically illuminated along the garden paths, creating a magical atmosphere that seemed to encourage confidences. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said finally. "Of course. That first day we met, when you proposed this arrangement, did you think we'd end up here, sitting together, talking like this?" Nathaniel considered the question seriously. "I thought we'd be polite strangers sharing a house," he admitted. "I didn't expect..." "What?" He looked at her then with an expression that made her heart race. "I didn't expect to want more." The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying in their implications. Claire felt her breath catch, felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. "Nathaniel, I should go in," he said abruptly, standing with the sharp movements of a man retreating from dangerous territory. Early meetings tomorrow. He was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone with the jasmine and the string lights and the echo of words that changed everything. The days following Nathaniel's confession in the garden pavilion carried a new tension. Not the awkward discomfort of strangers, but the charged awareness of two people who had acknowledged wanting something they couldn't quite name. Claire found herself hyper-aware of his presence. The way he lingered over coffee in the mornings, the soft sound of his footsteps in the hallway outside her room, the careful way he avoided touching her even in passing. It was during her pediatric rotation that Claire experienced her first real emergency as a medical student. 7-year-old Marcus Williams had been brought in by ambulance after falling from a tree, and what had initially appeared to be a simple broken arm quickly escalated when he began showing signs of internal bleeding. Claire had been observing in the trauma bay when Marcus suddenly went into shock. His blood pressure plummeted, his pulse became thready, and despite the medical team's best efforts, he was clearly in serious trouble. Doctor. Martinez barked orders, while nurses scrambled to establish better IV access and prepare blood products. Carter, Dr. Martinez called sharply, I need you to keep pressure on this abdominal wound while we prep for emergency surgery. Claire's hands moved automatically, pressing gauze pads against the source of bleeding while Marcus's mother sobbed in the hallway. The child was so small, so fragile, and for a terrifying moment, Claire felt completely overwhelmed by the responsibility of holding someone's life in her hands. You're doing great, Dr. Martinez said quietly, noting her pale complexion. Just keep steady pressure, we've got him. The surgery took 4 hours. Marcus had suffered a ruptured spleen from his fall, requiring immediate removal and careful repair of other internal injuries. By the time he was stable in recovery, Claire was emotionally and physically drained. She arrived home that evening later than usual, her scrubs still carrying the antiseptic smell of the hospital. The mansion felt impossibly peaceful after the chaos of the trauma bay, but Claire couldn't shake the image of Marcus's mother clinging to her husband while their son fought for his life. She found Nathaniel in his study, bent over what appeared to be funding proposals for the clinic's expansion. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and his expression immediately grew concerned. You look exhausted, he observed, setting down his pen. Long day. Claire leaned against the doorframe, suddenly feeling too tired to stand unsupported. We had a pediatric trauma that went to emergency surgery. 7-year-old boy. Is he all right? He will be. Dr. Martinez says he'll make a full recovery. But for a while there, she trailed off, reliving those moments when Marcus's vital signs had crashed. Nathaniel stood, moving around his desk with purposeful strides. Come here, he said gently, taking her arm and guiding her to the leather sofa near the fireplace. Sit down before you fall down. Claire sank into the soft cushions gratefully, closing her eyes as Nathaniel disappeared briefly and returned with a glass of water and what looked like a shot of whiskey. Drink the water first, he instructed, settling beside her on the sofa. Then the whiskey if you need it. The water helped, but it was Nathaniel's presence that truly steadied her, the solid warmth of him beside her, the way he seemed to radiate calm competence even in civilian clothes. She found herself leaning into his strength without conscious thought. Talk to me, he said quietly. What happened? Claire found herself describing the entire day, Marcus's fall, the rush to the hospital, the terrifying moments when they thought they might lose him. Nathaniel listened without interruption, his grey eyes focused entirely on her face. I knew going into medicine that I'd see people in pain, she concluded, but when it's a child, and his parents are looking at you like you have the power to save their world, she shook her head. How do you handle it? The weight of other people's lives? Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. You learn to compartmentalize, he said finally, to focus on what you can control rather than what you can't, and you remember that caring, really caring, makes you better at saving people, not worse, even when caring hurts, especially then. His voice carried conviction, born of experience. The moment you stop feeling the weight of responsibility is the moment you stop being fully human. Claire studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw that suggested he was speaking from personal knowledge. You've lost people, haven't you? People you were trying to save. Something dark flickered across Nathaniel's features. Everyone in medicine loses people. It's part of the cost of trying to heal. But it's not just medicine for you, is it? Claire pressed gently. You carry responsibility for everyone. The clinic patients, Mrs. Henderson, me. When do you get to just be Nathaniel, not the person everyone depends on? He turned to look at her then, and the vulnerability in his eyes took her breath away. I don't remember how to be just Nathaniel, he admitted quietly. I'm not sure that version of me exists anymore. Without thinking, Claire reached out and covered his hand with hers. His skin was warm, slightly rough from whatever physical work he did around the estate, and she felt the way his fingers tensed before gradually relaxing under her touch. Maybe he's still there, she said softly. Maybe he just needs someone to see him. Nathaniel stared down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. Claire, what happened to you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. What made you so afraid of letting people close? For a moment, she thought he would retreat behind his usual walls. Then, perhaps weakened by whiskey and the intimacy of the quiet study, he began to speak. I was engaged once, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Before my last deployment, Jessica was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, accomplished, from a good family. We had everything planned, the wedding, the house, the future. Claire felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she forced herself to remain still to let him continue. When I came back from overseas, I wasn't the same man who had left. PTSD, they called it, though the label didn't make it easier to live with. I had nightmares, panic attacks, episodes where I couldn't distinguish between past and present. His jaw tightened. Jessica tried to be understanding, but watching someone you love struggle with invisible wounds, it takes a toll. What happened? She left. The words were simple, but Claire heard years of pain in them. Said she couldn't watch me destroy myself, couldn't build a life with someone who might never be whole again. She wasn't wrong. I was a mess, angry and unpredictable, and drowning in guilt over things I couldn't change. Claire's heart ached for the younger version of Nathaniel, struggling with trauma, while the person who claimed to love him walked away when he needed support most. I'm sorry, she said quietly. That must have been devastating. It was clarifying, Nathaniel replied, though his tone suggested it had been anything but. I learned that depending on others is dangerous, that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. That's not true, Claire said firmly. What happened with Jessica doesn't define all relationships. Some people stay, Nathaniel. Some people fight for the people they love. He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts longing and disbelief. And how do you know the difference? How do you tell who will stay and who will run when things get difficult? Claire considered the question seriously. I think, she said slowly, you have to be brave enough to find out, to trust that some people are worth the risk. They sat in silence for several minutes, the fire crackling softly in the grate. Nathaniel's hand had turned palm up beneath hers, their fingers loosely intertwined in a connection that felt both natural and revolutionary. You stayed, he said suddenly. What? That night, when you were sick, when you woke up and found me asleep in the chair, you could have been embarrassed, insisted I leave. Instead, you thanked me for staying. Claire felt warmth spread through her chest. Of course I did. You took care of me when I needed it most. Jessica would have been mortified by the loss of dignity, Nathaniel said quietly. She believed suffering should be private, contained. Then Jessica was an idiot, Claire said with surprising vehemence. Suffering shared is suffering halved. Joy shared is joy doubled. That's what relationships are for, to carry each other's burdens and celebrate each other's victories. Nathaniel's smile was soft and genuine, transforming his entire face. Eleanor said something similar once. About the mathematics of love. Smart woman. She was. He squeezed Claire's fingers gently. She would have been proud of you today, you know. Taking care of that little boy. Carrying his parents' fears while staying strong enough to do your job. The praise, coming from him, meant more than any grade or evaluation. Claire felt tears prick her eyes, exhaustion and emotion finally catching up with her. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For seeing me. For understanding what today meant. Nathaniel's free hand came up to brush a tear from her cheek, his touch feather-light but burning. Thank you for seeing me too, for making me want to be seen. The words hung between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Claire felt her breathing shallow as Nathaniel's thumb traced across her cheekbone, his grey eyes dark with an emotion she was afraid to name. Then, as if catching himself, he pulled back, the moment shattering like glass. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice rough. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Claire nodded, though she made no move to leave the sofa. She wanted to stay in this warm circle of firelight, to continue mapping the contours of the man behind the careful facades. But she could see the way Nathaniel was already rebuilding his walls, preparing to retreat to safer emotional territory. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said softly, squeezing his hand once more before releasing it. "Good night, Claire." As she made her way upstairs, Claire could feel his eyes following her progress. And for the first time since moving into the Carter mansion, she fell asleep, thinking not about the practical arrangement that had brought them together, but about the slow, careful dance of two people learning to want something more. November brought Charleston's most perfect weather. Crisp mornings that gave way to golden afternoons, the kind of days that made tourists fall in love with the city. Claire found herself looking forward to coming home each evening, drawn by the promise of shared dinners and quiet conversations that revealed new layers of the man she'd married. The shift in their relationship was subtle, but undeniable. Nathaniel had begun joining her for morning coffee, their conversations ranging from her medical cases to his expansion plans for the clinic. He asked thoughtful questions about her rotations, remembered details from previous discussions, and offered insights that came from his own experience with trauma and healing. More telling were the small intimacies that had crept into their daily routine, the way he automatically steadied her elbow when she stumbled on the front steps, how she found herself straightening his tie when it sat slightly askew after long days at the clinic, the comfortable silences that stretched between them during evening walks through the garden. They were learning each other's rhythms, Claire realized, the careful choreography of two people beginning to trust. It was on a Thursday evening that their fragile equilibrium shattered. Claire had stayed late at the hospital to observe a complex pediatric surgery, arriving home well after their usual dinner time. She found the dining room empty, the table still set for two, and Mrs. Henderson clearing away what appeared to be an untouched meal. "I'm so sorry," Claire said immediately. "I should have called. The surgery ran much longer than expected." "No need to apologize, dear," Mrs. Henderson replied, though her expression was troubled. "Mr. Nathaniel waited until nearly 9 o'clock before giving up. Guilt twisted in Claire's stomach. In the 3 weeks since their conversation in his study, Nathaniel had made a point of being home for dinner each evening, often rearranging his schedule to accommodate her unpredictable rotations. That he had waited so long tonight spoke to expectations she hadn't realized were forming. She found him in the garden pavilion, still wearing his business clothes but with his jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up. A nearly empty bottle of bourbon sat on the table beside him, and his usual perfect posture had given way to the loose-limbed sprawl of a man who had been drinking steadily. "Nathaniel?" Claire approached cautiously, noting the dark expression on his face. "I'm sorry about dinner. The surgery... Dr. Richards called," he interrupted, his voice carrying a harsh edge she'd never heard before. "Seems you've been quite the topic of conversation at the hospital." Claire's stomach dropped. Dr. Richards was the chief of pediatrics, a man whose approval could make or break a medical student's career. "What did he say?" "He wanted to congratulate me on my wife's exceptional performance. Apparently you've been impressing everyone with your dedication and skill." Nathaniel's tone made the compliments sound like accusations. He was particularly effusive about your work with the trauma cases. "That's good news, isn't it?" Claire said carefully, sensing dangerous undercurrents in his mood. Nathaniel laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "He also mentioned how fortunate you are to have married into such a prominent family. How much easier it must be to focus on your studies without financial worries." Understanding dawned, cold and unpleasant. "You think he was suggesting I married you for money, weren't you?" The question came out sharp and cutting. A struggling medical student alone in the world, suddenly married to one of Charleston's most eligible bachelors? What conclusions would you draw? Claire felt as if he'd slapped her. "You know that's not what this is. You know why I accepted your proposal." "Do I?" Nathaniel stood abruptly, swaying slightly. "Because lately, I've been wondering if I know anything at all. You've been staying late at the hospital, coming home with stories about brilliant surgeries and inspiring mentors. Tell me, Claire, how long before you realize you don't need this arrangement anymore? How long before you find someone who can give you the real marriage you deserve?" The pain behind his accusation was unmistakable, even through the alcohol-fueled anger. Claire saw it clearly now, the fear that had been building as their relationship deepened, the terror of caring for someone who might leave just as Jessica had done. "You're drunk," she said quietly, "and you're saying things you don't mean." "Am I?" He stepped closer, and she could smell the bourbon on his breath, see the wild hurt in his grey eyes. "Or am I finally being honest about what this really is? A convenient arrangement that's outlived its usefulness?" "Stop it," Claire said firmly. "You don't believe that any more than I do, don't I?" His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "You want to know what I believe, Claire? I believe that eventually everyone leaves. Everyone finds something better, someone who isn't broken by war and guilt and the inability to love properly." The words hit her like physical blows, revealing the depths of his self-loathing and fear. Claire felt tears burn her eyes, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "You're right," she said quietly. "Everyone does leave, but not for the reasons you think." Nathaniel blinked as if her agreement had caught him off guard. "They leave because you push them away," Claire continued, her voice gaining strength. "Because you're so afraid of being abandoned that you create the very situation you're trying to avoid. You're doing it right now, picking a fight over nothing, trying to prove that I'm just like Jessica, just like everyone else who couldn't handle your walls." "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Don't I?" Claire moved closer, refusing to be intimidated by his anger. "You want me to leave, Nathaniel. You want me to prove that you can't trust anyone, that love is just another word for eventual disappointment. It would be so much easier than risking your heart again." "My heart?" The laugh that escaped him was bitter and broken. "You think this is about my heart?" "I think you're terrified," Claire said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I think you've been alone for so long that the possibility of real connection scares you more than any battlefield ever did. I think you're falling in love with me, and it's the most frightening thing you've ever experienced." The words hung between them like a challenge. Nathaniel went very still, his face cycling through a dozen emotions before settling into cold fury. "You arrogant little girl," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "You think 3 months of playing house gives you insight into my soul? You think your textbook psychology can explain away years of hard-learned lessons?" Claire flinched at the venom in his tone, but she held her ground. "I think you're hurting and you're lashing out at the person closest to you because that's what feels safe." "Safe?" Nathaniel's control finally snapped completely. "Nothing about you feels safe, Claire. Nothing about wanting you, caring about you, lying awake, thinking about you feels remotely safe. You want to know the truth. You terrify me. The way you look at me like I'm worth saving, like I'm capable of being the man you think you see. It's the most dangerous thing I've ever encountered." The confession exploded out of him like a dam bursting, raw and honest and devastating in its vulnerability. Claire felt her heart break and soar simultaneously, understanding finally that his cruelty came from a place of desperate fear. "Then stop fighting it," she whispered, stepping close enough to touch him. "Stop punishing us both for Jessica's failures." "I can't," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't survive losing someone else I care about. And I can't survive loving someone who's determined to prove I'll leave." Claire reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the tremor that ran through him at her touch. "So where does that leave us?" For a moment, they stood frozen in the space between heartbreak and possibility. Then Nathaniel's hands came up to cover hers, his eyes closing as if the touch caused him physical pain. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "I don't know how to love someone without destroying everything." "Then learn," Claire said simply. "We'll learn together." When he opened his eyes, they were bright with unshed tears. "What if I hurt you? What if I'm too damaged for this to work? Then we'll figure it out as we go. But you don't get to make that decision for both of us. You don't get to decide I'm going to leave before giving me the chance to stay." Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment, as if memorizing her face. Then, with infinite care, he pressed his forehead against hers. "I'm scared," he admitted, the words barely audible. "I know," Claire replied, her thumbs stroking across his cheekbones. "Me too." They stood like that in the garden pavilion, breathing the same air, sharing the weight of mutual fear and fragile hope. The bourbon and the angry words had stripped away their careful pretenses, leaving only the raw truth of two people who had found something worth fighting for. When Nathaniel finally kissed her, It was with the desperate tenderness of a man who had spent years believing he wasn't worthy of love. Claire kissed him back with all the fierce devotion of a woman who had chosen to stay, who would keep choosing to stay no matter how frightened they both became. It wasn't their first kiss. That would come later, under different circumstances, with different intentions. But it was the moment they both stopped pretending this was temporary, stopped believing they could keep their hearts safely locked away. It was the moment they chose each other, fears and all. The morning after their confrontation in the garden pavilion brought an awkwardness that was entirely different from their earlier formality. Claire woke to find a brief note slipped under her door. Gone for early meetings. Please don't feel obligated to wait for dinner. N. The careful politeness of the message told her everything she needed to know about Nathaniel's state of mind. In the harsh light of sobriety, he was mortified by his emotional outburst, retreating behind professional obligations and polite distance. Claire found Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen, preparing what looked like enough breakfast for a small army, despite the household's reduced numbers. Mr. Nathaniel left very early this morning, the housekeeper said without preamble, her tone carefully neutral. Said he had important meetings that would keep him out most of the day. I see. Claire poured herself coffee, noting the way Mrs. Henderson's movements had a sharp efficiency that suggested displeasure. Did he seem all right? Mrs. Henderson paused in her aggressive chopping of vegetables, fixing Claire with a look that held 30 years of watching Nathaniel Carter's self-destructive patterns. That boy, she said with fond exasperation, has been running from happiness since the day he came home from overseas. Every time something good happens, he finds a way to convince himself he doesn't deserve it. The war changed him, Claire said softly. The war hurt him, Mrs. Henderson corrected, but it was that terrible woman who broke him, taught him that love was conditional, that he had to earn the right to be cared for. She set down her knife with more force than necessary. If you're planning to do the same thing, you'd best tell me now so I can prepare. The fierce protectiveness in the older woman's voice made Claire's throat tight. I'm not going anywhere, Mrs. Henderson, even if he tries to push me away. Good. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. Because he needs someone who sees past all his careful armor to the good man underneath, someone who won't let him hide behind his fears. Claire spent the day at the hospital, but her concentration was fractured, her thoughts constantly drifting to Nathaniel and the raw vulnerability he'd shown the night before. During her lunch break, she found herself walking through the children's ward, drawn to the small patients who always managed to brighten her darkest moods. She was reading to 6-year-old Emma, a patient recovering from appendicitis, when Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway. Carter, could I speak with you for a moment? Claire finished the story, tucked Emma in for her nap, and followed Dr. Martinez to his office. She expected questions about her performance or upcoming evaluations, but his first words caught her completely off guard. I had an interesting conversation yesterday evening with someone claiming to be your husband. Heat flooded Claire's face. Doctor Martinez, I can explain. He called to thank me for the opportunities I've given you, and to ask whether there were additional ways he might support the pediatric program. Dr. Martinez's expression was thoughtful, rather than accusatory. It was an unusual conversation. Most spouses don't call to discuss their partner's medical training. Nathaniel is very invested in medical care, Claire said carefully. So I gathered. He seemed particularly interested in our trauma protocols and our work with underserved populations. Dr. Martinez leaned back in his chair. Carter, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but when you first started your rotations, I assumed you were here because of family connections. Your married name opened doors, and I thought perhaps your commitment to medicine was more social than professional. Claire's stomach dropped. And now? Now I realize I was wrong about both your motivation and your husband's character. Anyone who calls to discuss the ethics of pediatric trauma care isn't motivated by social climbing. Dr. Martinez smiled. He's genuinely invested in your success because he believes in your abilities, not because your achievements reflect well on him. Relief flooded through Claire, followed immediately by a confusing mixture of gratitude and frustration. Even when he was pulling away from her personally, Nathaniel was quietly supporting her professional development. He's a good man, she said softly. He's a complicated man, Dr. Martinez corrected. But yes, I believe he's good. Just guarded. Be patient with him, Carter. Men who've seen combat often struggle with emotional vulnerability. That evening, Claire returned home to find the dining room set for one. Mrs. Henderson served dinner with pointed efficiency, muttering under her breath about stubborn men who didn't know what was good for them. Claire ate alone, then retreated to the garden pavilion with her medical journals, hoping the familiar routine might draw Nathaniel out of whatever professional fortress he'd constructed. It was nearly 10 o'clock when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. Nathaniel appeared at the pavilion's entrance, looking exhausted and uncertain. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, and there was something tentative in his posture that suggested he wasn't sure of his welcome. "I wasn't sure you'd still be out here," he said quietly. "I was hoping you'd come home eventually," Claire replied, closing her textbook. "We need to talk." Nathaniel winced slightly but stepped into the pavilion, settling into the chair across from her with careful precision. "About last night?" "About this morning," Claire interrupted. "About the note you left, and the way you've been avoiding me all day. I thought it would be easier." "For whom?" Claire's voice was gentle but firm, "because it certainly wasn't easier for me to wake up feeling like I'd imagined everything that happened between us." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were white. "I said things I shouldn't have said, revealed things I had no right to burden you with." "You told me the truth," Claire corrected. "You were honest about your fears, your past, your feelings. That's not a burden, Nathaniel. That's trust." "Is it?" His grey eyes met hers, and she saw the confusion there, the genuine uncertainty of a man who had learned to equate emotional honesty with weakness, because it felt like falling apart. Claire's heart ached for him, for the boy who had learned to soldier through pain alone, for the man who had been taught that vulnerability was dangerous. Sometimes falling apart is the only way to rebuild something stronger. "And if I can't rebuild, if I'm too damaged for this to work?" The question was asked with such quiet desperation that Claire had to fight back tears. She rose from her chair and moved to kneel beside his, taking his hands in hers despite his initial resistance. "Look at me," she said softly. When he reluctantly met her gaze, she continued, "You are not damaged goods, Nathaniel Carter. You are a man who has survived incredible trauma and chosen to use that experience to help others. You are not too broken for love. You just haven't found the right person to love you through the healing. And you think you're that person." The question was tentative, almost afraid. "I know I want to be," Claire replied honestly. "I know that what I feel for you is stronger than my fear of getting hurt. I know that I've never met anyone who makes me want to be braver, kinder, better than I am." Nathaniel's breath caught. "Claire, I'm not Jessica," she said firmly. "I'm not going to run when things get difficult. I'm not going to love you conditionally, making you earn my affection through perfect behavior. I'm going to love you because of who you are, not despite it." The word love hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross so soon. Nathaniel stared at her with an expression of wonder and terror. "You don't know what you're saying," he whispered. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Claire brought his hands to her lips, pressing gentle kisses to his knuckles. "I'm saying I love you, Nathaniel. I love your careful morning routines and your secret kindnesses. I love the way you remember small details about people's lives, the way you carry everyone's burdens, as if they're your own responsibility. I love your dedication to healing others, even when you're struggling to heal yourself." Tears were sliding down Nathaniel's cheeks now, and he made no effort to hide them. "I don't know how to be loved," he admitted. "I don't know how to trust that it won't disappear." "Then let me teach you," Claire said simply. "The same way you've been teaching me about courage and selflessness, and what it means to truly care for others." Nathaniel pulled his hands free from hers, but only to cup her face with infinite tenderness. "What did I do to deserve you?" he whispered. "You don't have to deserve love, Nathaniel. You just have to accept it." When he kissed her this time, it was with the desperate gratitude of a man who had been wandering in the desert and suddenly found water. Claire kissed him back with all the patient devotion of a woman who understood that healing took time, that love was both fragile and resilient, that some victories were won not through grand gestures, but through the simple act of staying. They held each other in the garden pavilion until the automatic lights dimmed and the night sounds of Charleston settled around them. And for the first time since returning from war, Nathaniel Carter allowed himself to believe that perhaps he was worthy of the love being offered so freely Perhaps, with Claire's help, he could learn to love himself the way she already loved him, completely, unconditionally, with hope for the future rather than fear of the past. December arrived with an unexpected warmth, as if Charleston itself was celebrating the shift in the Carter household. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Doors left open between rooms, conversations that lingered over morning coffee, the sound of laughter echoing through halls that had been silent for too long. Nathaniel was still cautious, still prone to moments of withdrawal when emotions threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed defenses. But there was a new tenderness in the way he looked at Claire, a deliberate effort to let her into the spaces he had protected for so long. It began with small gestures. He started waiting for her to come home for dinner, no matter how late her rotations ran. Their evening walks through the garden became a cherished ritual, conversations flowing easily from medical cases to childhood memories to dreams for the future. He began sharing stories about his grandmother, about the early days of building the clinic, about the patients whose lives had been changed by access to proper medical care. Claire found herself falling deeper in love with him every day, not just with the controlled, competent exterior he showed the world, but with the man underneath who worried about everyone except himself, who carried other people's pain as if it were his own, who was learning slowly and carefully to believe he was worthy of happiness. The evening that changed everything began like any other. Claire had just finished a particularly challenging shift in the NICU, working with premature babies whose lives hung in the balance. She arrived home emotionally drained but exhilarated by the day's small victories, a baby who had finally been able to breathe without assistance, another who had gained enough weight to go home with his parents. She found Nathaniel in the kitchen, standing over the stove with an expression of intense concentration. The sight had become endearingly familiar, her methodical husband approaching cooking with the same precision he brought to everything else. "What culinary masterpiece are you creating tonight?" she asked, slipping her arms around his waist from behind. The casual intimacy of the gesture would have been unthinkable a month ago, but Nathaniel had gradually grown comfortable with her affectionate touches. He leaned back against her, solid and warm, and reassuringly present. "Shrimp and grits," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Mrs. Henderson left detailed instructions, but I'm not convinced I'm following them correctly." Claire peered over his shoulder at the pan, where perfectly seasoned shrimp sizzled alongside what looked like restaurant-quality stone-ground grits. "It looks perfect to me. You haven't tasted it yet. I don't need to. Everything you make is delicious." She pressed a kiss to the space between his shoulder blades, feeling the way his muscles relaxed under her touch. "How was your day?" "Productive. We broke ground on the new clinic location in North Charleston, and I had an interesting conversation with Dr. Patterson about expanding our mental health services." Claire felt a familiar flutter of pride at his dedication to serving the community. "That's wonderful. Mental health care is so underserved in rural areas." Nathaniel turned in her arms, his hands settling naturally at her waist. "And how was your day? You look tired." "Long but good. We had 3 babies graduate from the NICU today, all going home healthy." Claire smiled up at him, noting the way his eyes softened when she shared stories about her patients. There's something magical about watching parents hold their babies for the first time without all the medical equipment. Pure joy. "You love it," Nathaniel observed, his voice warm with affection. "The way your face lights up when you talk about healing people, it's beautiful." The compliment, delivered with such sincerity, made Claire's heart skip. Even after weeks of growing intimacy, she still felt surprised by these moments when Nathaniel let his guard down completely. "I love you," she said softly, the words coming as naturally as breathing. Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression, the last trace of wariness giving way to something that looked like wonder. "I love you too," he replied, and this time the words came without hesitation, without fear. They had said it before, but this felt different. Not a desperate confession in the midst of crisis, but a simple acknowledgement of truth. The way he looked at her, as if she were something precious and miraculous, made Claire feel beautiful and cherished and completely seen. "Nathaniel," she whispered, rising on her toes to close the distance between them. When their lips met, it was with a hunger that had been building for weeks. This wasn't the desperate kiss of fear or the gentle exploration of new affection. This was the kiss of two people who had stopped pretending they could resist what was growing between them. Nathaniel's hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer as if he couldn't bear even the smallest space between them. Claire melted into his strength, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt as the world narrowed to just this: the taste of him, the warmth of his mouth, the way he whispered her name like a prayer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. "The shrimp is going to burn," he said breathlessly. "I don't care," Claire replied, making no move to step away from him. Nathaniel laughed. A real laugh, full of joy and desire, and something that might have been relief. "Mrs. Henderson will never forgive me if I ruin her recipe." "Then turn off the stove," Claire suggested, her voice soft but unmistakably inviting. For a moment, Nathaniel went very still, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Claire, are you sure?" The question was asked with such careful tenderness that Claire felt tears prick her eyes. Even now, even when desire was clearly written across both their faces, he was giving her the choice, making sure she felt safe and cherished rather than pressured. "I've never been more sure of anything," she whispered. Nathaniel reached behind her and turned off the burner, never taking his eyes from her face. Then, with infinite care, he lifted her into his arms, carrying her from the kitchen as if she weighed nothing at all. The master bedroom was a reflection of Nathaniel himself, elegant, understated, with touches of warmth that spoke to the man beneath the controlled exterior. Claire had never been inside before, had respected the boundary of his private space even as their relationship deepened. Now, as he set her gently on her feet beside his bed, she felt the significance of the moment, not just the physical intimacy they were choosing, but the emotional barriers that were finally, completely, falling away. "Are you nervous?" Nathaniel asked softly, his hands framing her face with exquisite gentleness. "A little," Claire admitted, "but not about this, not about us." "What then?" Claire hesitated, then decided honesty had served them well so far. "I want to be enough for you. I want to be what you need." Nathaniel's expression grew fierce with tenderness. "Claire, you are everything I need, everything I never dared to hope for." His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones. "You've taught me how to want more than just survival. You've taught me how to hope." When he kissed her again, it was with a reverence that made Claire feel like the most precious thing in the world. His hands moved with careful worship, learning the shape of her through her clothes, making her feel beautiful and desired and completely cherished. The evening passed in a haze of whispered endearments and gentle discoveries. Nathaniel loved her with the same focused attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, learning what made her gasp, what made her arch into his touch, what made her call his name like a benediction. When she whispered that she had never done this before, he went very still, his eyes dark with emotion. "We can stop," he said immediately. "We can wait." "I don't want to wait," Claire interrupted, her hands framing his face. "I want this. I want you. I want our first time to be together." The way he made love to her was everything she had dreamed of and more. Patient and passionate, tender and consuming. He treated her innocence like a gift, her trust like something sacred. Every touch was deliberate, every kiss a promise, every whispered endearment a vow. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the lamplight, Nathaniel's fingers tracing lazy patterns on Claire's bare shoulder. She felt transformed, not just by the physical intimacy, but by the emotional completion of finding the person who matched her heart perfectly. "I love you," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person." Claire turned in his arms, studying his face in the golden light. The careful mask was completely gone now, replaced by open vulnerability and something that looked like awe. "I love you too," she replied, pressing a soft kiss to his chest directly over his heart. "Forever." As they drifted towards sleep, wrapped in each other's warmth, Claire thought about how far they had come from that awkward courthouse wedding months ago. They had found something neither had been looking for, a love that was patient and passionate, gentle and fierce, built on mutual respect and deepening trust. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose each other over fear. But tonight, in the sanctuary of Nathaniel's arms, Claire felt completely at peace with the path that had led them here. They had learned to dance together, the these two guarded hearts, and the music was just beginning. The week following their first night together passed in a golden haze of newfound intimacy. Claire had officially moved into the master bedroom, her belongings mingling with Nathaniel's in a way that felt both natural and revolutionary. They shared morning coffee in comfortable silence, fingers intertwined across the breakfast table, and evening conversations that stretched late into the night. But their bubble of happiness was destined to be tested. It began with a phone call during Claire's pediatric surgery rotation. She was observing a complex procedure when her pager buzzed with an urgent message to call home immediately. Fear iced through her veins as she thought of Nathaniel, of Mrs. Henderson, of all the terrible possibilities that could warrant such urgency. She found a quiet corridor and dialed with trembling fingers. "Claire." Mrs. Henderson's voice was strained with worry. "Thank goodness. You need to come home right away. Mr. Nathaniel, there's been an incident at the clinic." The drive home passed in a blur of terrifying scenarios. Car accident, heart attack, violence at one of the clinic locations. By the time Claire burst through the front door, her imagination had conjured every possible disaster. She found Nathaniel in his study, very much alive but looking haggard and exhausted. His left hand was bandaged, his shirt was torn, and there was a cut on his forehead that someone had cleaned but not properly treated. "What happened?" Claire demanded, immediately moving to examine his injuries with professional efficiency. "It's nothing serious," Nathaniel said, though he didn't resist her gentle probing. "Just a minor incident at the North Charleston location." "Minor?" Mrs. Henderson snorted from the doorway. "The man was attacked by some drug addict looking for pills. Could have been killed." Claire's blood turned to ice. "Someone attacked you?" "It wasn't an attack, exactly," Nathaniel said carefully. "More of a desperate request that got out of hand. James Butler, one of our regular patients, has been struggling with addiction since his work injury. When we couldn't prescribe the opioids he wanted, he became agitated." "Agitated enough to hurt you," Claire observed, noting the defensive wounds on his hands. "He's been in chronic pain for months. Desperation makes people do things they wouldn't normally consider." Nathaniel's voice carried no anger, only sad understanding. "I managed to talk him down, but not before he'd done some damage to the clinic." Claire finished cleaning the cut on his forehead, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "This is why you need security at these locations. You can't just walk into volatile situations without protection." "We're treating vulnerable populations," Nathaniel replied firmly. "Adding security would make the clinics feel like fortresses rather than safe spaces for healing." "And what good are safe spaces for healing if the healers get hurt?" Claire's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "What if James had had a weapon? What if you'd been seriously injured or worse?" Something flickered across Nathaniel's features, surprise perhaps at the vehemence of her concern. "I wasn't, though. I'm fine." "You're not fine," Claire said flatly. "You have defensive wounds, a head injury, and you're sitting here like it's perfectly normal for patients to attack you when they don't get what they want." "Claire." "No." She stepped back, suddenly seeing their situation with crystal clarity. "This is what you do, isn't it? You put yourself in danger to help others, and you expect everyone who loves you to just accept that risk?" Nathaniel went very still. "I help people who need help. That sometimes involves risk." "And what about the people who need you? What about Mrs. Henderson, who called me in tears because she thought something terrible had happened? What about me?" Claire's voice cracked slightly. "What about your wife, who just spent 30 minutes imagining your funeral?" "You're overreacting," Nathaniel said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Am I? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're so determined to save everyone else that you've forgotten some people would be destroyed if something happened to you." The words hung between them like a challenge. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and Claire recognized the familiar signs of him retreating behind his walls. "I can't stop helping people because of hypothetical dangers," he said coolly. "I'm not asking you to stop helping people. I'm asking you to value your own life enough to take reasonable precautions." Claire moved closer, her voice softening with desperation. "I'm asking you to remember that you're not expendable, Nathaniel. Not to the clinic, not to your patients, and certainly not to me." For a moment his mask slipped, and she saw the confusion there. The genuine bewilderment of a man who had spent so long believing his worth was measured by his usefulness to others, that he'd forgotten he had value simply for existing. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted quietly. "Then learn," Claire said, echoing his own words from weeks ago. "The same way I'm learning to trust that you won't push me away when things get difficult." The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Nathaniel studied her face with an expression that was equal parts admiration and frustration. "It's not the same thing," he said finally, "isn't it? You're asking me to trust you with my heart while refusing to trust me with your safety. You're asking me to build a future with you while treating your life like it's disposable." Claire's voice grew firmer. "That's not love, Nathaniel. That's martyrdom." The accusation hit its mark. Nathaniel flinched as if she'd slapped him, his face cycling through anger, hurt, and something that might have been recognition. "You don't understand," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Then help me understand. Explain to me why my fears about losing you are less valid than your fears about losing me. Explain why I should accept risks you would never ask me to take." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving around the study, as if searching for answers in the familiar surroundings. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because if I'm not helping people, what am I?" The question revealed everything. The core belief that had driven him since returning from war. The idea that his worth was conditional, earned through service and sacrifice rather than simply given through love. Claire felt her heart break for him all over again. "You're a man worth loving for who you are, not what you do. You're someone's husband, Mrs. Henderson's surrogate son, a friend to people who care about you regardless of your professional accomplishments. You wouldn't have married me if not for the clinic," Nathaniel pointed out. "I married you because Aunt Eleanor trusted you. I fell in love with you because of your kindness, your strength, your capacity for caring about others. The clinic is wonderful, but it's not why I love you." Claire moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his uninjured hand in both of hers. "I love you because you remember how I take my coffee, because you stay up late helping me study, because you carry everyone's burdens as if they're your own responsibility, because you make me want to be a better person." Tears were gathering in Nathaniel's eyes, though he was fighting them. "What if I can't change? What if I don't know how to value my own life the way you want me to? Then we'll figure it out together," Claire said simply. "But you have to want to try. You have to want to stay alive and healthy and safe for the people who love you." "I want to," he whispered. I don't know where to start." Claire rose and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, careful of the cut. "Start by promising me you'll consider adding security to the clinics. Not barriers, just presence. Someone trained to de-escalate situations before they become dangerous." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I can look into that. And promise me you'll talk to me before making decisions that could put you at risk. Not because I want to control you, but because I want to be part of the conversation about how to keep you safe." "Claire, promise me," she repeated firmly. "Promise me you'll remember that your life has value beyond what you can do for other people." Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment, as if memorizing her face. Then, with infinite care, he lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "I promise," he said quietly. "I'll try to remember that I'm worth saving too." It wasn't a complete transformation. Claire knew that changing deeply held beliefs would take time and patience. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that love sometimes meant being willing to change, to grow, to value yourself enough to stick around for the people who needed you. As she helped him upstairs to properly tend his injuries, Claire reflected on how much they had both changed since that awkward courthouse wedding. They were learning to be partners in the truest sense, supporting each other's dreams while protecting each other's hearts, challenging each other to be better while accepting each other completely. It was the kind of love worth fighting for, worth growing into, worth building a lifetime around. And for the first time since Mrs. Henderson's terrified phone call, Claire felt confident that they would have that lifetime together. January brought Charleston's brief winter, crisp mornings that required light jackets and evenings perfect for fires in the hearth. It also brought Claire's final semester of medical school, a reality that filled her with equal parts excitement and terror. The attack at the clinic had been a turning point for both of them. True to his promise, Nathaniel had hired trained security personnel for all clinic locations. Not guards, but counselors skilled in de-escalation who could identify and diffuse volatile situations before they became dangerous. The change had been met with some resistance from staff who worried about intimidating patients, but early results showed that the added layer of professional support actually made the clinics feel safer for everyone. More importantly, Nathaniel had begun including Claire in decisions that affected his safety and their future together. When the board of directors approached him about expanding to 3 additional locations, he discussed the proposal with her before responding. When a journalist wanted to write a feature story about his work, he asked her opinion about the potential publicity. "I like being consulted," Claire told him one evening as they walked through the garden. "It makes me feel like we're building something together, instead of me just watching you build things alone." Nathaniel's arm tightened around her waist. "I like consulting you. You see angles I miss, ask questions that make me think differently about problems." It was a small shift, but profound in its implications. For the first time in his adult life, Nathaniel was learning to see himself as part of a partnership, rather than a solitary force for good in the world. The real test came on a Thursday evening in late January. Claire was in the kitchen reviewing notes for her upcoming board exams when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway with an expression she couldn't quite read. "There's something I want to show you," he said, extending his hand with that careful formality that still emerged when he was nervous. Claire let him lead her to his study, where he pulled a thick folder from his desk drawer. The contents, when spread across the mahogany surface, took her breath away. Architectural plans, financial projections, and detailed proposals for something called the Eleanor Whitmore Memorial Center. "It would be a comprehensive healthcare facility," Nathaniel explained, his voice gaining enthusiasm as he pointed to different sections of the plans. "Primary care, pediatrics, women's health, mental health services, and a teaching component where new medical graduates could gain experience serving underserved populations." Claire studied the documents with growing amazement. The scope was breathtaking, a facility that could serve thousands of patients while training the next generation of community-focused physicians. "This is incredible," she breathed. "The research opportunities alone and the impact on the community would be enormous." "There's more." Nathaniel pulled out another set of documents. "I've been talking to the medical school about creating a residency program. New doctors would get training in community medicine while providing care to patients who might not otherwise have access to specialists." "Nathaniel, this is revolutionary. How long have you been planning this?" He was quiet for a moment, arranging papers with unnecessary precision. "Since the night you told me about Eleanor's belief in education as the path to independence, I started thinking about how to honor both her memory and her values." Claire felt tears prick her eyes. "You did this for her." "I did this for both of you," Nathaniel said softly. "For the woman who saw potential where others saw only problems, and for the woman who taught me to see potential in myself." The implications were staggering. Claire could see herself working in such a facility, could imagine the young doctors she might mentor, the families she could serve. It was everything she had dreamed of and more, a way to practice medicine that honored both professional excellence and human compassion. "There's one more thing," Nathaniel said, his voice carefully neutral. "The board would like to know if you'd be interested in serving as medical director once you complete your residency." Claire's head snapped up. "What?" "You'd oversee the clinical programs, manage the resident training, coordinate with the teaching hospital. It would be a significant responsibility, but the board believes, and I agree, that you have the vision and the skills to make it work." The offer was overwhelming in its scope and its implications. Medical director of a major healthcare facility at 25 years old. It was the kind of opportunity that came once in a lifetime, if at all. "Why me?" she asked. "There are doctors with decades more experience." "Because experience isn't the same as vision," Nathaniel interrupted gently. "Because you understand what it means to struggle for access to education and healthcare. Because you see patients as whole people, not just collections of symptoms." Claire stared at the plans, her mind racing. "This is what you've been working toward, isn't it? Not just expanding the existing clinics, but creating something completely new." "Something sustainable," Nathaniel confirmed. "Something that can continue serving the community long after we're gone." "We're." The casual inclusion of her in his long-term thinking sent warmth flooding through Claire's chest. This wasn't just about professional opportunity. It was about building a future together, creating something meaningful that would outlast their individual contributions. "I need time to think," she said finally. "It's an incredible opportunity, but it's also an enormous responsibility." "Take all the time you need," Nathaniel replied, though she could see the hope in his grey eyes. "The timeline is flexible. Construction wouldn't begin for another year, and the facility wouldn't open for at least 3 years after that." That night, Claire lay awake beside Nathaniel's sleeping form, her mind spinning with possibilities. The Eleanor Whitmore Memorial Center represented everything she had hoped to accomplish in medicine: comprehensive care, community focus, education, and social justice, all wrapped into one ambitious project. But more than that, it represented a future where she and Nathaniel could work side by side, where their shared values could translate into tangible change in people's lives. It was a chance to honor Eleanor's memory while building something new and beautiful together. "You're thinking very loudly," Nathaniel murmured beside her, his arm tightening around her waist. "Sorry, did I wake you?" "No, but I can feel your brain working from here." He pressed a sleepy kiss to her shoulder. "Talk to me." Claire turned in his arms, studying his face in the moonlight streaming through their bedroom windows. "Are you sure about this? About offering me such a significant role in something so important to you?" "I'm sure about you," Nathaniel replied without hesitation. "I'm sure about us. Everything else is just details." The simple certainty in his voice made Claire's decision for her. This man, who had learned to trust again after being so deeply hurt, was offering her not just professional opportunity, but true partnership. He was showing her a future where love and work could intertwine in beautiful, meaningful ways. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to what?" "Yes to the medical director position. Yes to building something extraordinary together. Yes to honoring Eleanor's memory and your grandmother's legacy." She pressed a soft kiss to his lips. "Yes to all of it." Nathaniel's smile was brilliant, even in the darkness. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Claire replied, echoing the words she'd spoken months ago when their relationship had first turned intimate. "I love you, Nathaniel Carter. I love the way you see possibilities where others see problems. I love that you want to change the world, and you want to do it with me." When he kissed her, it was with all the passion and tenderness of a man who had found his perfect partner in every sense of the word. They were building something together, not just a healthcare facility, but a life filled with purpose and love and the kind of deep satisfaction that came from meaningful work shared between two people who understood each other completely. As they made love in the quiet darkness, Claire thought about how far they had come from that awkward courthouse ceremony. They had become true partners, challenging each other to be better while supporting each other unconditionally. They had learned to dream together, to build together, to love together without reservation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, wrapped in Nathaniel's arms with their shared future spreading out before them like a promise, Claire felt nothing but gratitude for the path that had led them here. They were going to change the world together, and it was going to be beautiful. Spring arrived early in Charleston, painting the city in shades of pink and white as azaleas bloomed in glorious profusion. Claire was deep into her final clinical rotations, preparing for board exams while also working with Nathaniel on the preliminary planning for the Eleanor Whitmore Memorial Center. Their days were busy, but their evenings were filled with the comfortable intimacy of two people building a life together. It was during her obstetrics rotation that Claire first noticed something was different. She had always been sensitive to smells, but suddenly the antiseptic scent of the hospital made her nauseous. Coffee, which she had loved since childhood, began tasting wrong. Her fatigue, which she had attributed to the demanding schedule of medical school, seemed to deepen no matter how much she slept. The realization hit her during a routine morning at the hospital. She was observing a delivery when the sight and smell of the birth made her stomach rebel so violently that she had to excuse herself to be sick in the nearest restroom. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending obstetrician, found her there 20 minutes later, sitting on the floor with her head between her knees. "Carter, are you all right? You look terrible." "I think I'm coming down with something," Claire said weakly, though even as she spoke, a different possibility was taking shape in her mind. "Doctor..." Chen studied her with the practiced eye of someone who had seen thousands of pregnant women. "When was your last period?" The question hit Claire like a physical blow. She tried to remember, calculating backward through the blur of rotations and board exam preparation. Her cycles had always been irregular during times of stress, so she hadn't thought much about the delay. But now, forced to focus on the timeline, she realized it had been nearly 2 months. I'm not sure, she admitted. Doctor, Chen's expression softened with understanding. Would you like me to run a test just to rule it out? Claire nodded, not trusting her voice. The next 30 minutes passed in a haze of blood draws and anxious waiting. When Dr. Chen returned with the results, her smile told Claire everything she needed to know. Congratulations, she said gently. You're about 8 weeks along. The drive home passed in a blur of shock and wonder. Claire's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what she had learned. A baby. She was going to have a baby with Nathaniel. She found him in the garden pavilion, reviewing architectural plans with the intensity that characterized all his projects. He looked up as she approached, and his smile of greeting faded when he saw her expression. Claire, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. She sat down across from him, her hands trembling as she tried to find the words. How did you tell the man you loved that your entire future had just shifted in the most fundamental way possible? I need to tell you something, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel immediately set aside his papers, giving her his complete attention. What is it? Claire took a shaky breath. I went to the doctor today. I've been feeling sick and I thought I might have caught something at the hospital. Are you all right? Concern flooded Nathaniel's features, and he reached across the table to take her hands in his. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Nathaniel went very still, his grey eyes widening with shock. Pregnant, he repeated, as if testing the word. 8 weeks, Claire confirmed, watching his face carefully for any sign of his reaction. I know we never talked about children, never planned for this to happen so soon. A baby, Nathaniel said softly, wonder creeping into his voice. We're going to have a baby. Relief flooded through Claire at the joy beginning to dawn in his expression. Are you happy? She asked tentatively. Instead of answering, Nathaniel stood and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around the pavilion as laughter bubbled up from somewhere deep in his chest. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with tears. Happy? He cupped her face in his hands, his voice rough with emotion. Claire, I'm terrified and thrilled and completely overwhelmed. You're going to have our baby. We're going to have a baby, she corrected, and the possessive warmth in his smile made her heart soar. That evening, they sat curled together on the sofa in Nathaniel's study, Claire's head on his shoulder as they talked about the future that had suddenly become infinitely more complex and beautiful. The timing isn't ideal, Claire said, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. I'll be showing by the time I graduate and starting a residency while pregnant. We'll figure it out, Nathaniel said firmly. Whatever you need, whatever works best for you and the baby, we'll make it happen. The Memorial Center project will still be there when you're ready, he interrupted gently. Claire, this baby doesn't change our plans. It just means we get to include one more person in them. The simple acceptance in his voice made Claire's eyes fill with tears. I love you, she whispered. I love how you see possibilities instead of problems. I love you too, Nathaniel replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Both of you. The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of doctor's appointments, dietary changes, and careful adjustments to Claire's clinical schedule. Nathaniel threw himself into pregnancy research with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to everything else, reading medical journals and nutrition studies, until Claire teased him about becoming more knowledgeable about pregnancy than some obstetricians. Mrs. Henderson was beside herself with joy, immediately beginning to knit baby blankets and plan nursery decorations. She had opinions about everything from prenatal vitamins to cribs, all delivered with the authority of someone who had helped raise generations of Carter children. That woman has been waiting for grandchildren for 15 years, Nathaniel observed one evening, watching Mrs. Henderson enthusiastically discuss stroller options with Claire. She's going to spoil this baby rotten. Good, Claire replied, smiling at the older woman's evident delight. Every child deserves to be spoiled by someone who loves them unconditionally. It was during her 20th week that Claire experienced her first real scare. She was studying in the library when sharp cramping doubled her over, pain so intense that she could barely breathe. The student sitting next to her called for help, and within minutes Claire found herself in an ambulance, racing toward the hospital where she had spent so many hours as a student. Nathaniel met her in the emergency room, his face pale with fear. "The baby?" he asked immediately, taking her hand as the medical team worked around them. "I don't know," Claire whispered, terrified to voice her worst fears. The ultrasound revealed a healthy baby, active and growing normally. The cramping, the doctor explained, was likely round ligament pain, uncomfortable but harmless, a normal part of pregnancy as her body adapted to accommodate their growing child. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Patterson assured them, pointing to the image on the screen. "Strong heartbeat, normal growth patterns, no signs of distress." Claire stared at the grainy black and white image, making out the curve of a tiny spine, the flutter of a beating heart. "Is that your daughter, Dr. Patterson confirmed with a smile. "Congratulations. Daughter." The word hit Claire like a revelation. She was going to have a daughter, a little girl who would grow up in the beautiful Carter mansion, who would play in the garden where her parents had learned to love each other, who would be cherished and supported and encouraged to become anything she dreamed of being. Nathaniel was staring at the ultrasound image with an expression of pure wonder. "She's so small," he whispered. "She's perfect," Claire replied, and in that moment she meant it completely. Their daughter was perfect, their love was perfect, their future together was unfolding exactly as it should. That night, as they lay in bed with Nathaniel's hand resting protectively on Claire's growing belly, they talked about names and nursery colors and all the dreams they wanted to nurture in their daughter. "I want her to be strong," Claire said softly, "independent and kind, and unafraid to chase her dreams." "She will be," Nathaniel replied with quiet certainty. "With you as her mother, how could she be anything else? And with you as her father, she'll learn compassion and dedication and the importance of using your gifts to help others." They fell asleep that way, hands intertwined over the small life growing between them, hearts full of love and anticipation for the family they were creating together. In 6 months their daughter would arrive, but already she had changed everything, deepening their connection, amplifying their joy, giving them a future bright with possibility and purpose. Claire drifted towards sleep, thinking about Eleanor Whitmore, the woman whose wisdom had brought them together. Eleanor would have loved knowing that her great niece had found not just security in marriage, but the deepest kind of love, the kind that created new life, new hope, new reasons to believe in the beauty of the world. Their daughter would know that story someday, would understand that she was born from a love that had overcome fear and doubt to become something extraordinary. And perhaps, Claire thought drowsily, that knowledge would give her the courage to build something equally beautiful in her own life. May brought Charleston's most glorious weather and Claire's medical school graduation. She walked across the stage with her cap perched carefully over her growing belly, Nathaniel's proud applause echoing above the crowd. At 6 months pregnant, she glowed with health and happiness, her success made sweeter by the knowledge that their daughter was growing strong within her. The Eleanor Whitmore Memorial Center had broken ground the previous month, and Claire often found Nathaniel studying the construction progress with the satisfaction of a man watching his dreams take physical form. The project had attracted national attention, with medical schools across the country expressing interest in similar community-focused programs. "You're going to change how medicine is taught in this country," Claire told him one evening as they walked through the construction site, hard hats perched incongruously on their heads. "We're going to change it," Nathaniel corrected, his hand finding hers as they navigated around equipment and building materials. "This was always meant to be something we built together." Claire's residency would begin in the fall, after their daughter's birth. She had chosen family medicine with a focus on community health, a perfect preparation for her eventual role as medical director. The program director had been remarkably accommodating about maternity leave, perhaps influenced by Nathaniel's growing reputation in medical philanthropy. It was during one of her routine prenatal appointments that they received unexpected news. "Everything looks excellent," Dr. Patterson announced after completing the ultrasound. "Baby's growth is right on track, heartbeat is strong, and—" She paused, studying the screen with renewed interest. "What is it?" Claire asked, noting the slight frown on the doctor's face. I'm seeing something I didn't notice before. It might be nothing, but... Doctor. Patterson adjusted the ultrasound wand, getting a different angle. There, do you see that? Nathaniel leaned forward, squinting at the grainy image. What are we looking at? Dr. Patterson's frown transformed into a delighted smile. You're looking at baby number 2. Congratulations, you're having twins. The words hit them like a gentle explosion. Claire felt the world tilt sideways as she stared at the screen, now clearly showing 2 distinct forms nestled together in her womb. Twins? Nathaniel's voice was barely above a whisper. Fraternal twins by the looks of it. One was hiding behind the other during previous appointments. It happens more often than you'd think. Dr. Patterson beamed at them. 2 healthy babies due in early September. The drive home passed in stunned silence. 2 babies. They were going from a couple to a family of 4 in a matter of months. Claire's hand rested on her belly, marveling at the idea that 2 tiny lives were growing there. Are you terrified? She asked Nathaniel as they pulled into their driveway. Absolutely, he replied without hesitation. Are you? Completely. Claire turned to look at him, taking in his expression of wonder and mild panic, but also incredibly happy. 2 babies, Nathaniel said, as if testing the reality of it. We're going to need a bigger nursery. That evening, they sat in the garden pavilion where so many important conversations had taken place, redesigning their immediate future around the reality of twins. Mrs. Henderson had taken the news with characteristic efficiency, immediately beginning to research double strollers and twin feeding schedules. The Memorial Center will have to wait, Claire said reluctantly. I can't imagine managing 2 newborns and a medical director position. Maybe, Nathaniel replied thoughtfully. Or maybe we adjust the timeline. The center won't be fully operational for another 2 years. By then the twins will be old enough for more predictable schedules. Claire studied his profile in the gathering dusk. You really think we can do this? Manage 2 babies, my residency, your work, and launching a major medical facility. I think, Nathaniel said slowly, that we've already proven we can handle more than we ever thought possible. We've learned to trust each other, to build something beautiful together. Adding 2 more people to love just makes everything more complicated and more wonderful. 3 months later, Claire woke to her first contraction at 5:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Nathaniel, ever prepared, had her hospital bag packed and ready by the door. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and at 11:47 p.m., Eleanor Rose Carter made her entrance into the world, followed 12 minutes later by her brother, James Nathaniel Carter. Claire held her daughter while Nathaniel cradled their son, both of them crying openly at the miracle of new life. Eleanor had Claire's auburn hair and Nathaniel's grey eyes, while James bore his father's dark colouring and his mother's stubborn chin. They're perfect, Nathaniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Absolutely perfect. Look what we made, Claire marvelled, studying Eleanor's tiny features. Look what our love created. Mrs. Henderson arrived the next morning with flowers, homemade blankets, and enough casseroles to feed the household for a month. She took one look at the twins and declared them the most beautiful babies ever born, an assessment that brooked no argument. The first months were a blur of feedings and diaper changes, sleepless nights, and overwhelming love. Nathaniel proved to be a devoted father, handling middle-of-the-night emergencies with the same calm competence he brought to medical crises. He learned to change diapers with military precision and could rock both babies to sleep simultaneously when necessary. Claire began her residency when the twins were 4 months old, grateful for the flexible scheduling that allowed her to maintain her academic commitments while staying actively involved in their care. The Memorial Center construction continued on schedule, and she found herself looking forward to the day when she could begin the work she and Nathaniel had planned together. On a crisp December evening, as they sat by the fire with the twins sleeping peacefully in their bouncy seats, Claire reflected on the extraordinary year they had shared. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked Nathaniel, who was reading construction reports while keeping one eye on the babies. "When you proposed this arrangement?" "Every day," he replied, setting aside his papers to focus on her completely. "I think about how terrified I was of letting you into my life, how certain I was that caring for someone would only lead to disappointment. And now?" Nathaniel's smile was soft and full of wonder. "Now I know that loving you, loving our family, is the most important thing I've ever done. Everything else is just details. Claire moved to sit beside him on the sofa, nestling into his familiar warmth. Eleanor would be so proud of what we've built together. She would, Nathaniel agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. She believed in the power of love to heal and transform. She saw the potential for happiness where others saw only problems. As if summoned by their conversation, baby Eleanor stirred in her seat, making the soft, mewling sounds that preceded full wakefulness. Nathaniel rose immediately, scooping her up with practiced ease. "Hello, beautiful girl," he murmured, settling back beside Claire with their daughter cradled against his chest. "Were we talking too loudly?" Eleanor gazed up at her father with the serious expression that had characterized her from birth, as if she were studying his face to memorize every detail. James continued sleeping peacefully, already displaying the unflappable temperament that would serve him well as the son of busy parents. "I love our life," Claire said softly, watching Nathaniel's gentle interaction with their daughter. "I love what we've become together." "We're just getting started," Nathaniel replied, his voice full of promise. "The Memorial Center, watching the twins grow up, all the lives we'll touch and the differences we'll make. It's all ahead of us." Claire smiled, imagining their future, the twins taking their first steps in the Carter Mansion's garden, learning to read in the same library where their parents had fallen in love, growing up surrounded by the legacy of service and compassion that defined their family. She could see herself working alongside Nathaniel at the Memorial Center, training the next generation of doctors while raising the next generation of Carters. It was a beautiful future, built on the foundation of a love that had overcome fear, doubt, and the painful lessons of the past. They had learned to trust each other completely, to build something meaningful together, to create a family grounded in mutual respect and unwavering devotion. The marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement had become the greatest love story of their lives. 5 years later, the Eleanor Whitmore Memorial Center stood proudly in the heart of North Charleston, its modern glass and brick facade softened by carefully planted gardens that bloomed year-round. Claire walked through the main corridor on a busy Thursday morning, her white coat bearing the title Medical Director, and her heart full of satisfaction at the bustling activity around her. The center had exceeded every expectation. In its 2 years of operation, they had served over 15,000 patients, trained 32 residents in community medicine, and established satellite programs in 3 rural counties. Medical schools from across the nation sent delegations to study their innovative approach to healthcare education. Dr. Carter, a young resident, approached with a patient chart. "The Martinez family is here for their follow-up. Maria's diabetes management has improved significantly since starting the nutrition program." "Excellent news," Claire replied, taking the chart. "Make sure to document the lifestyle changes that made the difference. That data helps us refine the program for other patients." At 30, Claire had grown into her role as medical director with grace and authority. She had completed her residency while managing twins and a household, proving that determination and excellent support could overcome any obstacle. The twins, now 5 years old, were thriving, Eleanor showing early signs of her mother's empathy and her father's analytical mind, while James displayed an adventurous spirit tempered by surprising wisdom. Nathaniel had expanded his role as well, serving on the board of 3 major medical foundations while maintaining his hands-on involvement with daily operations. His reputation as a visionary in community healthcare had grown beyond Charleston, but he remained grounded in the work that had first given his life meaning. Their marriage had deepened with each passing year, strengthened by shared challenges and mutual respect. They had learned to balance demanding careers with active parenting, supporting each other's ambitions, while never losing sight of what mattered most, their family and their commitment to serving others. "Mama!" Eleanor's voice echoed through the center's main lobby as she ran toward Claire, followed closely by James and Mrs. Henderson, who still insisted on bringing the children for their weekly visits, despite being well into her 70s. "What are you two doing here?" Claire asked, crouching to embrace both children. "Daddy said we could see the new baby ward," James announced importantly, "and Mrs. Henderson made cookies for the nurses." The pediatric wing had been their latest addition, funded by donations from grateful families and medical equipment companies, impressed by the center's outcomes. Claire had lobbied hard for the expansion, believing that comprehensive family care was essential to community health. "Where is your father?" Claire asked, noting that Nathaniel wasn't with the group. "He's in the meeting room with important people," Eleanor replied solemnly. They were talking about numbers and charts, and looked very serious. Claire smiled at her daughter's assessment. The important people were likely representatives from the CDC, who were considering the Memorial Center as a model for a national community health initiative. It was the kind of recognition that could transform their local success into widespread change. "Mrs. Henderson, would you mind taking the twins to see the art therapy room? Mrs. Patterson has new supplies they might enjoy." "Of course, dear. Come along, children. Let's see what wonderful creations we can make." Claire made her way to the administrative wing, finding Nathaniel in the conference room with 5 officials in expensive suits. Through the glass wall she could see him in his element. Passionate, articulate, making the case for community-centered healthcare with the conviction that had first drawn her to him. When the meeting concluded 30 minutes later, the visitors emerged looking impressed and energized. Nathaniel saw her waiting and approached with the satisfied expression of a man who had just won an important battle. "How did it go?" Claire asked as the officials departed with handshakes and promises to be in touch soon. "Very well. They want to pilot our residency model in 12 cities across the southeast." Nathaniel's smile was triumphant. "We'd oversee the implementation, train the administrators, help establish the satellite programs." "That's incredible!" Claire felt excitement bubble up in her chest. "How many people could we potentially serve? Conservatively, over 100,000 patients in the first 3 years, and if the pilot succeeds, they're talking about national expansion." Claire stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished. What had started as a single man's vision to honor his grandmother's memory had become a revolution in how America approached community health care. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly. "Proud of us. Look what we've built together." Nathaniel pulled her into his arms, holding her close in the empty conference room. "Do you remember that first night in the garden pavilion, when you told me I was afraid of wanting more than survival?" "I remember you being terrified that I'd leave," Claire replied, smiling at the memory. "I was. But you were right about the wanting. You taught me that it was safe to dream big, to build something beautiful, to believe in a future worth fighting for." They were interrupted by the sound of running feet and children's laughter. Eleanor and James burst into the conference room, followed by a breathless Mrs. Henderson. "Sorry," she panted. "They escaped while I was talking to Dr. Rodriguez about the new diabetes education program." "Mama, we painted pictures," James announced, holding up artwork that appeared to depict their family standing in front of a very tall building covered in flowers. "It's the hospital where you and Daddy help people get better," Eleanor explained seriously, "and those are healing flowers that make everyone happy." Claire felt tears prick her eyes at her daughter's innocent wisdom. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Should we hang it in Daddy's office?" "Yes, and we made one for your office too." Eleanor produced a second masterpiece, this one showing stick figures of various sizes, holding hands in a circle around the same flower-covered building. "That's all the families you help," James added helpfully. "Mrs. Henderson says you and Daddy are like superhero doctors who fix whole neighborhoods." Nathaniel laughed, scooping up both children in a gesture that had become second nature. "I think Mrs. Henderson might be exaggerating our abilities." "Not at all," the housekeeper protested. "These children should know what their parents have accomplished. They should understand that love and hard work can change the world." That evening, as they had every evening for over 5 years, the Carter family gathered for dinner in the mansion's formal dining room. The table that had once felt vast with just 2 people now accommodated high chairs, sippy cups, and the cheerful chaos of family life. "Tell us about your day," Nathaniel said to the twins, a ritual that had begun when they were barely old enough to talk. "I learned about butterflies," Eleanor reported. "Did you know they start as caterpillars and then sleep in a cocoon and wake up completely different? Like Mama and Daddy," James added matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Henderson says you used to be sad and scared, but then you found each other and turned into happy people who help everyone." Claire caught Nathaniel's eye across the table, seeing her own amazement reflected in his expression. Their children, with the clear-eyed wisdom of innocence, had understood something profound about transformation and love. "Mrs. Henderson is very wise," Nathaniel said gently. People can change when they find the right reasons to grow. And when they find people who believe in them, Claire added, thinking of Eleanor Whitmore's faith in an arrangement that had seemed impossible, of her own willingness to trust a guarded stranger, of Nathaniel's courage in opening his heart again. After dinner they walked through the garden, as had become their tradition. The twins ran ahead, chasing fireflies and investigating every flower and interesting bug. Claire and Nathaniel followed hand in hand, comfortable in the silence that came from years of shared understanding. "Do you ever wonder what Eleanor would think of all this?" Claire asked, watching their children play in the same garden where their love story had unfolded. "I think she'd be amazed by how much happiness her matchmaking produced," Nathaniel replied. "2 grandchildren she never got to meet, a thriving medical center, thousands of lives improved, and us." "Especially us," Claire agreed. "I think she always knew we were meant for each other, even when we couldn't see it ourselves." As they reached the garden pavilion where so many important conversations had taken place, Nathaniel pulled her into his arms for the kind of kiss that still made her heart race after all these years. "I love you, Mrs. Carter," he murmured against her lips. "More every day, more than I thought possible." "I love you too," Claire replied, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. "Forever and always." The twins' laughter echoed through the garden as twilight settled over Charleston, fireflies beginning their nightly dance among the ancient oaks. In the distance, the lights of the city twinkled like earthbound stars, including the warm glow of the Eleanor Whitmore Memorial Center, where tomorrow they would continue the work of healing and hope. It was a perfect ending to a perfect day in a life that had turned out more beautiful than either of them had dared to dream. They had found love where they least expected it, built something meaningful together, and created a family grounded in service and devotion. The arrangement that had begun with legal documents and practical necessity had become the greatest love story of their lives, proof that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the smallest steps of faith. As they walked back toward the house, children in tow and hearts full of contentment, Claire thought about the young woman who had once stood in this same garden, terrified and alone, agreeing to marry a stranger. That woman could never have imagined the joy that awaited her, the love that would transform her, the children who would fill her days with laughter, the meaningful work that would give her life purpose. The silence between heartbeats had become a symphony of shared dreams and gentle whispers, of children's laughter and quiet confidences, of a love that had grown stronger with each passing day. It was, Claire realized as Nathaniel's hand squeezed hers in the gathering darkness, exactly the kind of happiness that Eleanor Whitmore had envisioned when she wrote that careful will so many years ago. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.